Table of contents. Imprenta. Preface to getting married. The revolt against marriage. Marriage nevertheless inevitable. What does the word marriage mean? Survivals of sex slavery. The new attack on marriage. A forgotten conference of married men. Hearth and home. Too much of a good thing. Large and small families. The gospel of, for better for worse. Wanted and immoral statesmen. The limits of democracy. The science and art of politics. Why statesmen shirk the marriage question. The question of population. The right to motherhood. Monogamy, polygyny, and polyandry. The male revolt against polygyny. Difference between Oriental and Occidental polygyny. The old maid's right to motherhood. A giant stitch. Remoteness of the facts from the ideal. Difficulty of obtaining evidence. Marriage as a magic spell. The impersonality of sex. The economic slavery of women. Unpopularity of impersonal views. Impersonality is not promiscuity. Domestic change of air. Home manners are bad manners. Spurious natural affection. Carrying the war into the enemy's country. Shelley and Queen Victoria. A probable effect of giving women the vote. The personal sentimental basis of monogamy. Divorce. Importance of sentimental grievance. Divorce without asking why. Economic slavery, again the root difficulty. Labor exchanges and the white slavery. Divorce favorable to marriage. Male economic slavery and the rights of bachelors. The pathology of marriage. The criminology of marriage. Does it matter? Christian marriage. Divorce a sacramental duty. And what is to become of the children? The cost of divorce. Conclusions. The revolt against marriage. Marriage nevertheless inevitable. What does the word marriage mean? Survivals of sex slavery. The new attack on marriage. A forgotten conference of married men. Hearth and home. Too much of a good thing. Large and small families. The gospel of, for better for worse. Wanted and immoral statesmen. The limits of democracy. The science and art of politics. Why statesmen shirk the marriage question. The question of population. The right to motherhood. Monogamy, polygyny, and polyandry. The male revolt against polygyny. Difference between Oriental and Occidental polygyny. The old maid's right to motherhood. A chain stitch. Remoteness of the facts from the ideal. Difficulty of obtaining evidence. Marriage as a magic spell. The impersonality of sex. The economic slavery of women. Unpopularity of impersonal views. Impersonality is not promiscuity. Domestic change of air. Home manners are bad manners. Spurious natural affection. Carrying the war into the enemy's country. Shelley and Queen Victoria. A probable effect of giving women the vote. The personal sentimental basis of monogamy. Divorce. Importance of sentimental grievance. Divorce without asking why. Economic slavery, again the root difficulty. Labor exchanges and the white slavery. Divorce favorable to marriage. Male economic slavery and the rights of bachelors. The pathology of marriage. The criminology of marriage. Does it matter? Christian marriage. Divorce a sacramental duty. And what is to become of the children? The cost of divorce. Conclusions. Preface. Personi. Getting married. Getting married. Getting married. Colophon. Landmarks. Getting married. Getting married, George Bernard Shaw. Colophon. Getting Married was published in 1911 by George Bernard Shaw. This was produced for Standard by Asher Smith and is based on a transcription produced in 2004 by Eve, David, and distributed proofreaders for Project and on digital scans from the Internet Archive. The cover page is adapted from Girl with a Veil, a painting completed circa 1908 by Frank. The cover and title pages feature the League Spartan and Sorts Mill typefaces created in 2014 and 2009 by the Leg of Type. This edition was released on May 21, 2026, 6:29 p.m. and is based on revision C08B582. The first edition of this was released on August 20, 2025, 6:26 p.m. You can check for updates to this, view its revision history, or download it for different systems at org. George Bernard Shaw. Getting Married. The volunteer-driven Standard project relies on readers like you to submit typos, corrections, and other improvements. Anyone can contribute at .org. Personi. Mrs. Alice. Mrs. Alice. Alderman William Collins. Alderman William Collins. General Boxer. General Boxer. Miss. Mr. Reginald. Mr. Reginald. Mrs. Leo. Mrs. Leo. The Bishop of Chelsea, Alfred. The Bishop of Chelsea, Alfred. Mr. John. Mr. John. Mr. Mr. Miss. Father. The Beadle Joseph. The Beadle Joseph. Mrs. George Maris Zenobia Polly Collins. Mrs. George Maris Zenobia Polly Collins. Getting Married. On a fine morning in the spring of 1908, the Norman kitchen in the palace of the Bishop of Chelsea looks very spacious and clean and handsome and healthy. The bishop is lucky enough to have a XII century palace. The palace itself has been lucky enough to escape being carved up into XV century Gothic, or shaved into XVII century ashlar, or restored by a XIX century builder and a Victorian architect with a deep sense of the umbrella-like gentlemanliness of XIV century vaulting. The present occupant, A. Chelsea, unofficially Alfred, appreciates Norman work. He has, by adroit complaints of the discomfort of the place, induced the ecclesiastical commissioners to give him some money to spend on it, and with this he has got rid of the wallpapers, the paint, the partitions, the exquisitely planed and casings with which the Victorian cabinet makers enclosed and hid the huge black beams of hewn oak, and of all other expedients of his predecessors to make themselves feel at home and respectable in a Norman fortress. It is a house built to last forever. The walls and beams are big enough to carry the Tower of Babel, as if the builders, anticipating our modern ideas and instinctively defying them, had resolved to show how much material they could lavish on a house built for the glory of God, instead of keeping a competitive eye on the advantage of sending in the lowest tender, and scientifically calculating how little material would be enough to prevent the whole affair from tumbling down by its own weight. The kitchen is the bishop's favorite room. This is not at all because he is a man of humble mind, but because the kitchen is one of the finest rooms in the house. The bishop has neither the income nor the appetite to have his cooking done there. The windows, high up in the wall, look north and south. The north window is the largest, and if we look into the kitchen through it, we see facing us the south wall with small Norman windows and an open door near the corner to the left. Through this door we have a glimpse of the garden and of a garden chair in the sunshine. In the right-hand corner is an entrance to a vaulted circular chamber with a winding stair leading up through a tower to the upper floors of the palace. In the wall to our right is the immense fireplace, with its huge spit like a baby crane, and a collection of old iron and brass instruments which pass as the original furniture of the fire, though as a matter of fact they have been picked up from time to time by the bishop at second-hand shops. In the near end of the left-hand wall, a small Norman door gives access to the bishop's study, formerly a scullery. Further along, a great oak chest stands against the wall. Across the middle of the kitchen is a big timber table surrounded by 11 stout rush-bottomed chairs, 4 on the far side, 3 on the near side, and 2 at each end. There is a big chair with railed back and sides on the hearth. On the floor is a drugget of thick matting. The only other piece of furniture is a clock with a wooden dial about as large as the bottom of a washtub, the weights, chains, and pendulum being of corresponding magnitude, but the bishop has long since abandoned the attempt to keep it going. It hangs above the oak chest. The kitchen is occupied at present by the bishop's lady, Mrs., who is talking to Mr. William Collins, the greengrocer. He is in evening dress, though it is early forenoon. Mrs. is a quiet, happy-looking woman of 50 or thereabouts, placid, gentle, and humorous, with delicate features and fine hair with many white threads. She is dressed as for some festivity, but she is taking things easily as she sits in the big chair by the hearth, reading the Times. Collins is an elderly man with a rather youthful waist. His mutton-chop whiskers have a coquettish touch at their lower ends. He is an affable man, with those perfect manners which can be acquired only in keeping a shop for the sale of necessaries of life to ladies whose social position is so unquestionable that they are not anxious about it. He is a reassuring man with a vigilant eye and the power of saying anything he likes to you without offense, because his tone always implies that he does it with your kind permission. Withal by no means servile, rather gallant and compassionate, but never without a conscientious recognition on public grounds of social distinctions. He is at the oak chest counting a pile of napkins. Mrs. reads placidly, Collins counts, a blackbird sings in the garden. Mrs. puts the Times down in her lap and considers Collins for a moment. When other lips and other hearts their tale of love shall tell. Sardonically, in language whose excess imparts the power they feel so well. Though hollow hearts may wear a mask, break your own to see in such a moment I but ask that you'll remember me. And you will. I shall put my spell on you. Getting Married. A play. Imprenta. This is the product of many hours of hard work by volunteers for Standard, and builds on the hard work of other literature lovers made possible by the public domain. This particular is based on a transcription from Project and on digital scans from the Internet Archive. The source text and artwork in this are believed to be in the United States public domain. That is, they are believed to be free of copyright restrictions in the United States. They may still be copyrighted in other countries, so users located outside of the United States must check their local laws before using this. The creators of and contributors to this dedicate their contributions to the worldwide public domain via the terms in the CC01 Universal Public Domain Dedication. For full license information, see the at the end of this. Standard is a volunteer-driven project that produces editions of public domain literature using modern typography, technology, and editorial standards, and distributes them free of cost. You can download this and other carefully produced for true book lovers at .org. Preface to Getting Married. The revolt against marriage. There is no subject on which more dangerous nonsense is talked and thought than marriage. If the mischief stopped at talking and thinking, it would be bad enough, but it goes further into disastrous anarchical action. Because our marriage law is inhuman and unreasonable to the point of downright abomination, the bolder and more rebellious spirits form illicit unions, defiantly sending cards round to their friends announcing what they have done. Young women come to me and ask me whether I think they ought to consent to marry the man they have decided to live with, and they are perplexed and astonished when I, who am supposed, heaven knows why, to have the most advanced views attainable on the subject, urge them on no account to themselves without the security of an authentic wedding ring. They cite the example of George, who formed an illicit union with. They quote a saying attributed to Nietzsche, that a married philosopher is ridiculous, though the men of their choice are not philosophers. When they finally give up the idea of reforming our marriage institutions by private enterprise and personal righteousness, and consent to be led to the registry or even to the altar, They insist on first arriving at an explicit understanding that both parties are to be perfectly free to sip every flower and change every hour, as their fancy may dictate, in spite of the legal bond. I do not observe that their unions prove less monogamic than other people's. Rather the contrary, in fact. Consequently, I do not know whether they make less fuss than ordinary people when either party claims the benefit of the treaty. But the existence of the treaty shows the same anarchical notion that the law can be set aside by any two private persons by the simple process of promising one another to ignore it. Marriage nevertheless inevitable. Now most laws are, and all laws ought to be, stronger than the strongest individual. Certainly the marriage law is. The only people who successfully evade it are those who actually avail themselves of its shelter by pretending to be married when they are not, and by bohemians who have no position to lose and no career to be closed. In every other case, open violation of the marriage laws means either downright ruin or such inconvenience and disablement as a prudent man or woman would get married 10 times over rather than face. And these disablements and inconveniences are not even the price of freedom, for, as has shown so convincingly in, an avowedly illicit union is often found in practice to be as tyrannical and as hard to escape from as the worst legal one. We may take it then that when a joint domestic establishment, involving questions of children or property, is contemplated, marriage is in effect compulsory upon all normal people, and until the law is altered there is nothing for us but to make the best of it as it stands. Even when no such establishment is desired, clandestine irregularities are negligible as an alternative to marriage. How common they are nobody knows, for in spite of the powerful protection afforded to the parties by the law of libel, and the readiness of society on various other grounds to be hoodwinked by the keeping up of the very thinnest appearances, most of them are probably never suspected. But they are neither dignified nor safe and comfortable, which at once rules them out for normal decent people. Marriage remains practically inevitable, and the sooner we acknowledge this, the sooner we shall set to work to make it decent and reasonable. What does the word marriage mean? However much we may all suffer through marriage, most of us think so little about it that we regard it as a fixed part of the order of nature, like gravitation. Except for this error, which may be regarded as constant, we use the word with reckless looseness, meaning a dozen different things by it, and yet always assuming that to a respectable man it can have only one meaning. The pious citizen, suspecting the socialist, for example, of unmentionable things, and asking him heatedly whether he wishes to abolish marriage, is infuriated by a sense of unanswerable quibbling when the socialist asks him what particular variety of marriage he means. English civil marriage, sacramental marriage, indissoluble Roman Catholic marriage, marriage of divorced persons, Scotch marriage, Irish marriage, French, German, Turkish, or South Dakotan marriage. In Sweden, one of the most highly civilized countries in the world, a marriage is dissolved if both parties wish it, without any question of conduct. That is what marriage means in Sweden. In that is what they call by the senseless name of free love. In the British Empire we have unlimited polygamy, Muslim polygamy limited to 4 wives, child marriages, and nearer home, marriages of first cousins, all of them abominations in the eyes of many worthy persons. Not only may the respectable British champion of marriage mean any of these widely different institutions, sometimes he does not mean marriage at all. He means monogamy, chastity, temperance, respectability, morality, Christianity, anti-socialism, and a dozen other things that have no necessary connection with marriage. He often means something that he dare not avow, ownership of the person of another human being, for instance. And he never tells the truth about his own marriage either to himself or anyone else. With those individualists who in the mid-XIX century dreamt of doing away with marriage altogether on the ground that it is a private concern between the two parties with which society has nothing to do, there is now no need to deal. The vogue of the self-regarding action has passed, and it may be assumed without argument that unions for the purpose of establishing a family will continue to be registered and regulated by the state. Such registration is marriage, and will continue to be called marriage long after the conditions of the registration have changed so much that no citizen now living would recognize them as marriage conditions at all if he revisited the earth. There is therefore no question of abolishing marriage, but there is a very pressing question of improving its conditions. I have never met anybody really in favor of maintaining marriage as it exists in England today. A Roman Catholic may obey his church by assenting verbally to the doctrine of indissoluble marriage. But nobody worth counting believes directly, frankly, and instinctively that when a person commits a murder and is put into prison for 20 years for it, the free and innocent husband or wife of that murderer should remain bound by the marriage. To put it briefly, a contract for better or for worse is a contract that should not be tolerated. As a matter of fact, it is not tolerated fully even by the Roman Catholic Church, for Roman Catholic marriages can be dissolved, if not by the temporal courts, by the Pope. Indissoluble marriage is an academic figment, advocated only by celibates and by comfortably married people who imagine that if other couples are uncomfortable, it must be their own fault, just as rich people are apt to imagine that if other people are poor, it serves them right. There is always some means of dissolution. The conditions of dissolution may vary widely, from those on which Henry VII procured his divorce from of, to the pleas on which American wives obtain divorces, for instance, mental anguish caused by the husband's neglect to cut his toenails. But there is always some point at which the theory of the inviolable better-for-worse marriage breaks down in practice. South Carolina has indeed passed what is called a freak law, declaring that a marriage shall not be dissolved under any circumstances, but such an absurdity will probably be repealed or amended by sheer force of circumstances before these words are in print. The only question to be considered is, what shall the conditions of the dissolution be? Survivals of sex slavery. If we adopt the common romantic assumption that the object of marriage is bliss, then the very strongest reason for dissolving a marriage is that it shall be disagreeable to one or other or both of the parties. If we accept the view that the object of marriage is to provide for the production and rearing of children, then childlessness should be a conclusive reason for dissolution. As neither of these causes entitles married persons to divorce, it is at once clear that our marriage law is not founded on either assumption. What it is really founded on is the morality of the 10th commandment, which English women will one day succeed in obliterating from the walls of our churches by refusing to enter any building where they are publicly classed with a man's house, his ox, and his ass as his purchased chattels. In this morality, female adultery is malversation by the woman and theft by the man, whilst male adultery with an unmarried woman is not an offense at all. But though this is not only the theory of our marriage laws, but the practical morality of many of us, it is no longer an avowed morality, nor does its persistence depend on marriage, for the abolition of marriage would, other things remaining unchanged, leave women more effectually enslaved than they now are. We shall come to the question of the economic dependence of women on men later on, but at present we had better confine ourselves to the theories of marriage which we are not ashamed to acknowledge and defend, and upon which, therefore, marriage reformers will be obliged to proceed. We may, I think, dismiss from the field of practical politics the extreme sacerdotal view of marriage as a sacred and indissoluble covenant, because though reinforced by unhappy marriages, as all fanaticisms are reinforced by human sacrifices, it has been reduced to a private and socially inoperative eccentricity by the introduction of civil marriage and divorce. Theoretically, our civilly married couples are to a Catholic as unmarried couples are, that is, they are living in open sin. Practically, civilly married couples are received in society, by Catholics and everyone else, precisely as sacramentally married couples are, and so are people who have divorced their wives or husbands and married again. And yet marriage is enforced by public opinion with such ferocity that the least suggestion of laxity in its support is fatal to even the highest and strongest reputations, although laxity of conduct is winked at with grinning indulgence, so that we find the austere Shelley denounced as a fiend in human form, whilst Nelson, who openly left his wife and formed a with Sir William and Lady Hamilton, was idolized. Shelley might have had an illegitimate child in every county in England if he had done so frankly as a sinner. His unpardonable offense was that he attacked marriage as an institution. We feel a strange anguish of terror and hatred against him, as against one who threatens us with a mortal injury. What is the element in his proposals that produces this effect? The answer of the specialists is the one already alluded to, that the attack on marriage is an attack on property, so that Shelley was something more hateful to a husband than a horse thief, to wit, a wife thief, and something more hateful to a wife than a burglar, namely, one who would steal her husband's house from over her head and leave her destitute and nameless on the streets. Now, no doubt this accounts for a good deal of anti-Shelleyan prejudice, a prejudice so deeply rooted in our habits that, as I have shown in my play, Men who are bolder freethinkers than Shelley himself can no more bring themselves to commit adultery than to commit any common theft, whilst women who loathe sex slavery more fiercely than Mary are unable to face the insecurity and discredit of the vagabondage, which is the masterless woman's only alternative to celibacy. But in spite of all this, there is a revolt against marriage, which has spread so rapidly within my recollection, that though we all still assume the existence of a huge and dangerous majority which regards the least hint of as to the beauty and holiness of marriage as infamous and abhorrent, I sometimes wonder why it is so difficult to find an authentic living member of this dreaded army of convention outside the ranks of the people who never think about public questions at all, and who, for all their numerical weight and apparently invincible prejudices, accept social changes today as tamely as their forefathers accepted the Reformation under Henry and Edward, the Restoration under Mary, and after Mary's death, the which Elizabeth compounded from both doctrines and called the Articles of the Church of England. If matters were left to these simple folk, there would never be any changes at all, and society would perish like a snake that could not cast its skins. Nevertheless, the snake does change its skin in spite of them, and there are signs that our marriage law skin is causing discomfort to thoughtful people and will presently be cast whether the others are satisfied with it or not. The question therefore arises, what is there in marriage that makes the thoughtful people so uncomfortable? The new attack on marriage. The answer to this question is an answer which everybody knows and nobody likes to give. What is driving our ministers of religion and statesmen to blurt it out at last is the plain fact that marriage is now beginning to depopulate the country with such alarming rapidity that we are forced to throw aside our modesty like people who, awakened by an alarm of fire, rush into the streets in their nightdresses or in no dresses at all. The fictitious free lover, who was supposed to attack marriage because it thwarted his inordinate affections and prevented him from making life a carnival, has vanished and given place to the very real, very strong, very austere avenger of outraged decency, who declares that the licentiousness of marriage, now that it no longer recruits the race, is destroying it. As usual, this change of front has not yet been noticed by our newspaper controversialists and by the suburban season ticket holders whose minds the newspapers make. They still defend the citadel on the side on which nobody is attacking it and leave its weakest front undefended. The religious revolt against marriage is a very old one. Christianity began with a fierce attack on marriage, and to this day the celibacy of the Roman Catholic priesthood is a standing protest against its compatibility with the higher life. His reluctant sanction of marriage, his personal protest that he countenanced it of necessity and against his own conviction, his contemptuous better to marry than to burn, is only out of date in respect of his belief that the end of the world was at hand and that there was therefore no longer any population question. His instinctive recoil from its worst aspect as a slavery to pleasure, which induces two people to accept slavery to one another, has remained an active force in the world to this day, and is now stirring more uneasily than ever. We have more and more Pauline celibates whose objection to marriage is the intolerable indignity of being supposed to desire or live the married life as ordinarily conceived. Every thoughtful and observant minister of religion is troubled by the determination of his flock to regard marriage as a sanctuary for pleasure, seeing as he does that the known libertines of his parish are visibly suffering much less from intemperance than many of the married people who stigmatize them as monsters of vice. A forgotten conference of married men. The late Price Hughes, an eminent Methodist divine, once organized in London a conference of respectable men to consider the subject. Nothing came of it, nor indeed could have come of it in the absence of women, but it had its value as giving the young sociologists present, of whom I was one, an authentic notion of what a picked audience of respectable men understood by married life. It was certainly a staggering revelation. Peter the Great would have been shocked, would have been horrified. Don would have fled from the conference into a monastery. The respectable men all regarded the marriage ceremony as a rite which absolved them from the laws of health and temperance, inaugurated a lifelong honeymoon, and placed their pleasures on exactly the same footing as their prayers. It seemed entirely proper and natural to them that out of every 24 hours of their lives they should pass 8 shut up in one room with their wives alone, and this not bird-like for the mating season, but all the year round and every year. How they settled even such minor questions as to which party should decide whether and how much the window should be open, and how many blankets should be on the bed, and at what hour they should go to bed and get up so as to avoid disturbing one another's sleep, seemed insoluble questions to me. But the members of the conference did not seem to mind. They were content to have the whole national housing problem treated on a basis of one room for two people. That was the essence of marriage for them. Please remember, too, that there was nothing in their circumstances to check intemperance. They were men of business, that is, men for the most part engaged in routine work which neither their minds nor their bodies to the full pitch of their capacities. Compared with statesmen, first-rate professional men, artists, and even with laborers and artisans as far as muscular exertion goes, they were underworked and could spare the fine edge of their faculties and the last few inches of their chests without being any the less fit for their daily routine. If I had adopted their habits, a startling deterioration would have appeared in my writing before the end of a fortnight and frightened me back to what they would have considered an impossible asceticism. But they paid no penalty of which they were conscious. They had as much health as they wanted, that is, they did not feel the need of a doctor. They enjoyed their smokes, their meals, their respectable clothes, their affectionate games with their children, their prospects of larger profits or higher salaries, their Saturday half-holidays and Sunday walks, and the rest of it. They did less than 2 hours work a day, and took from 7 to 9 office hours to do it in. And they were no good for any mortal purpose except to go on doing it. They were respectable only by the standard they themselves had set. Considered seriously as electors governing an empire through their votes, and choosing and maintaining its religious and moral institutions by their powers of social persecution, they were a black-coated army of calamity. They were incapable of comprehending the industries they were engaged in, the laws under which they lived, or the relation of their country to other countries. They lived the lives of old men contentedly. They were timidly conservative at the age at which every healthy human being ought to be obstreperously revolutionary. And their wives went through the routine of the kitchen, nursery, and drawing-room just as they went through the routine of the office. They had all, as they called it, settled down, like balloons that had lost their lifting margin of gas, and it was evident that the process of settling down would go on until they settled into their graves. They read old-fashioned newspapers with effort, and were just taking with avidity to a new sort of paper, costing a halfpenny, which they believed to be extraordinarily bright and attractive, and which never really succeeded until it became extremely dull, discarding all serious news and replacing it by vapid tittle-tattle, and substituting for political articles informed by at least some of knowledge of economics, history, and constitutional law, such paltry follies and sentimentalities. Snobberies and as ignorance can understand and irresponsibility relish. What they called patriotism was a conviction that because they were born in Tooting, or they were the natural superiors of, and all other benighted foreigners. Those of them who did not think it wrong to go to the liked above everything a play in which the hero was called Dick, was continually fingering a briar pipe, and after being overwhelmed with admiration and affection through 3 acts, was finally rewarded with the legal possession of a pretty heroine's person on the strength of a staggering lack of virtue. Indeed, their only conception of the meaning of the word virtue was abstention from stealing other men's wives or from refusing to marry their daughters. As to law, religion, ethics, and constitutional government, any counterfeit could impose on them. Any atheist could pass himself off on them as a bishop, any anarchist as a judge, any despot as a Whig, any sentimental socialist as a Tory, any philter or witch-finder as a man of science, any phrase-maker as a statesman. Those who did not believe the story of Jonah and the great fish were all the readier to believe that metals can be transmuted and all diseases cured by radium, and that men can live for 200 years by drinking sour milk. Even these credulities involved too severe an intellectual effort for many of them. It was easier to grin and believe nothing. They maintained their respect for themselves by playing the game, that is, doing what everybody else did, and by being good judges of hats, ties, dogs, pipes, cricket, gardens, flowers, and the like. They were capable of discussing each other's solvency and respectability with some shrewdness, and could carry out quite complicated systems of paying visits and knowing one another. They felt a little vulgar when they spent a day at Margate, and quite distinguished and travelled when they spent it at. They were, except as to their clothes, not particular. That is, they could put up with ugly sights and sounds, unhealthy smells, and inconvenient houses, with inhuman apathy and callousness. They had, as to adults, a theory that human nature is so poor that it is useless to try to make the world any better, whilst as to children they believed that if they were only sufficiently lectured and whipped, they could be brought to a state of moral perfection such as no fanatic has ever ascribed to his deity. Though they were not intentionally malicious, they the most appalling cruelties from mere thoughtlessness, thinking nothing of imprisoning men and women for periods up to 20 years for breaking into their houses, of treating their children as wild beasts to be tamed by a system of blows and imprisonment which they called education, and of keeping pianos in their houses not for musical purposes, but to torment their daughters with a senseless stupidity that would have revolted an inquisitor. In short, dear reader, they were very like you and me. I could fill 100 pages with the tale of our imbecilities and still leave much untold, but what I have set down here haphazard is enough to condemn the system that produced us. The cornerstone of that system was the family and the institution of marriage as we have it today in England. Hearth and home. There is no shirking it. If marriage cannot be made to produce something better than we are, marriage will have to go, or else the nation will have to go. It is no use talking of honor, virtue, purity, and wholesome, sweet, clean, English home lives when what is meant is simply the habits I have described. The flat fact is that English home life today is neither honorable, virtuous, wholesome, sweet, clean, nor in any creditable way distinctively English. It is in many respects conspicuously the reverse, and the result of withdrawing children from it completely at an early age and sending them to a public school and then to a university, does, in spite of the fact that these institutions are class-warped and in some respects quite abominably corrupt, produce men. Women, too, are improved by the escape from home provided by women's colleges, but as very few of them are fortunate enough to enjoy this advantage, most women are so thoroughly homebred as to be unfit for human society. So little is expected of them that in Sheridan's School for Scandal, we hardly notice that the heroine is a female cad, as detestable and dishonorable in her repentance as she is vulgar and silly in her naughtiness. It was left to an abnormal critic like George to point out the glaring fact that in the remarkable set of life studies of XIX century women to be found in the novels of Dickens, the most convincingly real ones are either vilely unamiable or comically contemptible, whilst his attempts to manufacture admirable heroines by idealizations of homebred womanhood are not only absurd but not even pleasantly absurd. One has no patience with them. As all this is corrigible by reducing home life and domestic sentiment to something like reasonable proportions in the life of the individual, the danger of it does not lie in human nature. Home life as we understand it is no more natural to us than a cage is natural to a cockatoo. Its grave danger to the nation lies in its narrow views, its unnaturally sustained and spitefully jealous concupiscences, its petty tyrannies, its false social, its endless grudges and squabbles, its sacrifice of the boy's future by setting him to earn money to help the family when he should be in training for his adult life, remember the boy Dickens and the blacking factory, and of the girl's chances by making her a slave to sick or selfish parents. Its unnatural packing into little brick boxes of little parcels of humanity of ill-assorted ages, with the old scolding or beating the young for behaving like young people, and the young hating and thwarting the old for behaving like old people, and all the other ills, mentionable and unmentionable, that arise from excessive segregation. It sets these evils up as benefits and blessings representing the highest attainable degree of honor and virtue, whilst any criticism of or revolt against them is savagely persecuted as the extremity of vice. The revolt, driven underground and exacerbated, produces debauchery veiled by hypocrisy, an overwhelming demand for licentious theatrical entertainments which no censorship can stem, and worst of all, a confusion of virtue with the mere morality that steals its name until the real thing is loathed because the imposture is loathsome. Literary traditions spring up in which the libertine and profligate Tom Jones and Charles Surface are the heroes, and decorous, law-abiding persons and Joseph Surface are the villains and butts. People like to believe that Nell has every amiable quality and the bishop's wife every odious one. Poor Mr. Pecksniff, who is generally no worse than a humbug with a turn for pompous talking, is represented as a criminal instead of as a very typical English paterfamilias, keeping a roof over the head of himself and his daughters by inducing people to pay him more for his services than they are worth. In the extreme instances of reaction against convention, female murderers get sheaves of offers of marriage, and when nature throws up that rare phenomenon, an unscrupulous libertine, his success among well-brought-up girls is so easy, and the devotion he inspires so extravagant, that it is impossible not to see that the revolt against conventional respectability has transfigured a commonplace rascal into a sort of anarchist. As to the respectable voluptuary who joins clubs and vibrates to invocation of dolors to come down and redeem us from virtue, he is to be found in every suburb. Too much of a good thing. We must be reasonable in our domestic ideals. I do not think that life at a public school is altogether good for a boy any more than barrack life is altogether good for a soldier. But neither is home life altogether good. Such good as it does, I should say, is due to its freedom from the very atmosphere it professes to supply. That atmosphere is usually described as an atmosphere of love, and this definition should be sufficient to put any sane person on guard against it. The people who talk and write as if the highest attainable state is that of a family stewing in love continuously from the cradle to the grave can hardly have given 5 minutes serious consideration to so outrageous a proposition. They cannot have even made up their minds as to what they mean by love, for when they expatiate on their thesis, they are sometimes talking about kindness and sometimes about mere appetite. In either sense, they are equally far from the realities of life. No healthy man or animal is occupied with love in any sense for more than a very small fraction, indeed, of the time he devotes to business and to recreations wholly unconnected with love. A wife entirely preoccupied with her affection for her husband, a mother entirely preoccupied with her affection for her children, may be all very well in a book for people who like that kind of book, but in actual life she is a nuisance. Husbands may escape from her when their business compels them to be away from home all day, but young children may be, and quite often are, killed by her cuddling and coddling and doctoring and preaching, above all by her continuous attempts to excite precocious sentimentality, a practice as objectionable and possibly as mischievous as the worst tricks of the worst nursemaids. Large and small families. In most healthy families, there is a revolt against this tendency. The exchanging of presents on birthdays and the like is barred by general consent, and the relations of the parties are placed by express treaty on an unsentimental footing. Unfortunately, this mitigation of family sentimentality is much more characteristic of large families than small ones. It used to be said that members of large families get on in the world, and it is certainly true that for purposes of social training a household of 20 surpasses a household of 5, as an Oxford college surpasses an 8-roomed house in a cheap street. 10 children, with the necessary adults, make a community in which an excess of sentimentality is impossible. 2 children make a doll's house, in which both parents and children become morbid if they keep to themselves. What is more, when large families were the fashion, they were organized as tyrannies much more than as atmospheres of love. Francis Place tells us that he kept out of his father's way because his father never passed a child within his reach without striking it, and though the case was an extreme one, it was an extreme that illustrated a tendency. Sir Walter's father, when his son incautiously expressed some relish for his porridge, dashed a handful of salt into it with an instinctive sense that it was his duty as a father to prevent his son enjoying himself. Ruskin's mother the sensual side of her maternal passion, not by cuddling her son, but by whipping him when he fell downstairs or was slack in learning the Bible off by heart, and this grotesque safety valve for voluptuousness, mischievous as it was in many ways, had at least the advantage that the child did not enjoy it and was not debauched by it, as he would have been by transports of sentimentality. But nowadays we cannot depend on these safeguards, such as they were. We no longer have large families. All the families are too small to give the children the necessary social training. The Roman father is out of fashion, and the whip and the cane are becoming discredited, not so much by the old arguments against corporal punishment, sound as these were, as by the gradual wearing away of the veil from the fact that flogging is a form of debauchery. The advocate of flogging as a punishment is now exposed to very disagreeable suspicions, and ever since rose to the effort of making a certain very ridiculous confession on the subject, there has been a growing perception that child whipping, even for the children themselves, is not always the innocent and high-minded practice it professes to be. At all events, there is no getting away from the facts that families are smaller than they used to be, and that passions which formerly took effect in tyranny have been largely diverted into sentimentality. And though a little sentimentality may be a very good thing, chronic sentimentality is a horror more dangerous, because more possible than the erotomania which we all condemn when we are not thoughtlessly glorifying it as the ideal married state. The gospel of, let us try to get at the root error of these false domestic doctrines. Why was it that the late Samuel Butler, with a conviction that increased with his experience of life, preached the gospel of urging people to be temperate in what they called goodness as in everything else? Why is it that I, when I hear some well-meaning person exhort young people to make it a rule to do at least one kind action every day, feel very much as I should if I heard them persuade children to get drunk at least once every day? Apart from the initial absurdity of accepting as permanent a state of things, in which there would be in this country misery enough to supply occasion for several thousand million kind actions per, the effect on the character of the doers of the actions would be so appalling that 1 month of any serious attempt to carry out such counsels would probably bring about more stringent legislation against actions going beyond the strict letter of the law in the way of kindness than we have now against excess in the opposite direction. There is no more dangerous mistake than the mistake of supposing that we cannot have too much of a good thing. The truth is, an immoderately good man is very much more dangerous than an immoderately bad man. That is why was burnt and John of torn to pieces with red-hot pincers, whilst multitudes of unredeemed rascals were being let off with clipped ears, burnt palms, a flogging, or a few years in the galleys. That is why Christianity never got any grip of the world, until it virtually reduced its claims on the ordinary citizen's attention to a couple of hours every seventh day, and let him alone on weekdays. If the fanatics who are preoccupied day in and day out with their salvation were healthy, virtuous, and wise, the of the ordinary man might be regarded as a deplorable shortcoming, but as a matter of fact, no more frightful misfortune could threaten us than a general spread of fanaticism. What people call goodness has to be kept in check just as carefully as what they call badness, for the human constitution will not stand very much of either without serious psychological mischief, ending in insanity or crime. The fact that the insanity may be privileged, as was up to the point of wrecking the social life of Florence, does not alter the case. We always hesitate to treat a dangerously good man as a lunatic because he may turn out to be a prophet in the true sense, that is, a man of exceptional sanity who is in the right when we are in the wrong. However necessary it may have been to get rid of, it was foolish to poison Socrates and burn of Arc. But it is none the less necessary to take a firm stand against the monstrous proposition that because certain attitudes and sentiments may be heroic and admirable at some momentous crisis, they should or can be maintained at the same pitch continuously through life. A life spent in prayer and alms-giving is really as insane as a life spent in cursing and picking pockets. The effect of everybody doing it would be equally disastrous. The superstitious tolerance so long accorded to monks and nuns is inevitably giving way to a very general and very natural practice of confiscating their retreats and expelling them from their country, with the result that they come to England and Ireland, where they are partly unnoticed and partly encouraged because they conduct technical schools and teach our girls softer speech and gentler manners than our comparatively ruffianly elementary teachers. But they are still full of the notion that because it is possible for men to attain the summit of, and stay there for an hour, it is possible for them to live there. Children are punished and scolded for not living there, and adults take serious offense if it is not assumed that they live there. As a matter of fact, ethical strain is just as bad for us as physical strain. It is desirable that the normal pitch of conduct at which men are not conscious of being particularly virtuous, although they feel mean when they fall below it, should be raised as high as possible, but it is not desirable that they should attempt to live above this pitch any more than that they should habitually walk at the rate of 5 miles an hour or carry a hundredweight continually on their backs. Their normal condition should be in no wise difficult or remarkable, and it is a perfectly sound instinct that leads us to mistrust the good man as much as the bad man, and to object to the clergyman who is pious extra-professionally as much as to the professional pugilist who is quarrelsome and violent in private life. We do not want good men and bad men any more than we want giants and dwarfs. What we do want is a high quality for our normal, that is, people who can be much better than what we now call respectable without self-sacrifice. Conscious goodness, like conscious muscular effort, may be of use in emergencies, but for everyday national use it is negligible, and its effect on the character of the individual may easily be disastrous. For better, for worse, It would be hard to find any document in practical daily use in which these obvious truths seem so stupidly overlooked as they are in the marriage service. As we have seen, the stupidity is only apparent. The service was really only an honest attempt to make the best of a commercial contract of property and slavery by subjecting it to some religious restraint and elevating it by some touch of poetry. But the actual result is that when two people are under the influence of the most violent, most insane, most delusive, and most transient of passions, they are required to swear that they will remain in that excited, abnormal, and exhausting condition continuously until death do them part. And though of course nobody expects them to do anything so impossible and so unwholesome, yet the law that regulates their relations and the public opinion that regulates that law is actually founded on the assumption that the marriage vow is not only feasible but beautiful and holy, and that if they are false to it, they deserve no sympathy and no relief. If all married people really lived together, no doubt the mere force of facts would make an end to this inhuman nonsense in a month, if not sooner, but it is very seldom brought to that test. The typical British husband sees much less of his wife than he does of his business partner, his fellow clerk, or whoever works beside him day by day. Man and wife do not, as a rule, live together. They only breakfast together, dine together, and sleep in the same room. In most cases, the woman knows nothing of the man's working life, and he knows nothing of her working life. He calls it her home life. It is remarkable that the very people who romance most absurdly about the closeness and sacredness of the marriage tie are also those who are most convinced that the man's sphere and the woman's sphere are so entirely separate that only in their leisure moments can they ever be together. A man as intimate with his own wife as a magistrate is with his clerk, or a prime minister with the leader of the opposition, is a man in 10,000. The majority of married couples never get to know one another at all. They only get accustomed to having the same house, the same children, and the same income, which is quite a different matter. The comparatively few men who work at home, writers, artists, and to some extent have to effect some sort of segregation within the house, or else run a heavy risk of overstraining their domestic relations. When the pair is so poor that it can afford only a single room, the strain is intolerable. Violent quarreling is the result. Very few couples can live in a single-room tenement without exchanging blows quite frequently. In the leisured classes, there is often no real family life at all. The boys are at a public school, the girls are in the schoolroom in charge of a governess, the husband is at his club or in a set which is not his wife, and the institution of marriage enjoys the credit of a domestic peace which is hardly more intimate than the relations of prisoners in the same or guests at the same garden party. Taking these two cases of the single room and the unearned income as the extremes, we might perhaps locate at a guess on the scale between them any particular family stands. But it is clear enough that the one-roomed end, though its conditions enable the marriage vow to be carried out with the utmost attainable exactitude, is far less endurable in practice, and far more mischievous in its effect on the parties concerned, and through them on the community, than the other end. Thus we see that the revolt against marriage is by no means only a revolt against its sordidness, as a survival of sex slavery. It may even plausibly be maintained that this is precisely the part of it that works most smoothly in practice. The revolt is also against its sentimentality, its romance, even against its enervating happiness. Wanted an immoral statesman. We now see that the statesman who undertakes to deal with marriage will have to face an amazingly complicated public opinion. In fact, he will have to leave opinion as far as possible out of the question and deal with human nature instead. For even if there could be any real public opinion in a society like ours, which is a mere mob of classes, each with its own habits and prejudices, it would be at best a jumble of superstitions and interests, taboos and hypocrisies, which could not be reconciled in any coherent enactment. It would probably proclaim passionately that it does not matter in the least what sort of children we have, or how few or how many, provided the children are legitimate. Also that it does not matter in the least what sort of adults we have, provided they are married. No statesman worth the name can possibly act on these views. He is bound to prefer one healthy illegitimate child to 10 rickety legitimate ones, and one energetic and capable unmarried couple to a dozen inferior apathetic husbands and wives. If it could be proved that illicit unions produce 3 children each and marriages only 1.5, he would be bound to encourage illicit unions and discourage and even penalize marriage. The common notion that the existing forms of marriage are not political contrivances, but sacred ethical obligations to which everything, even the very existence of the human race, must be sacrificed if necessary, and this is what the vulgar morality we mostly profess on the subject comes to, is one on which no sane government could act for a moment. And yet it influences, or is believed to influence, so many votes that no government will touch the marriage question if it can possibly help it, even when there is a demand for the extension of marriage, as in the case of the recent long-delayed act legalizing marriage with a deceased wife's sister. When a reform in the other direction is needed, for example, an extension of divorce, not even the existence of the most unbearable hardships will induce our statesmen to move so long as the victims submit sheepishly, though when they take the remedy into their own hands, an inquiry is soon begun. But what is now making some action in the matter imperative is neither the sufferings of those who are tied for life to criminals, drunkards, physically unsound and dangerous mates, and worthless and unamiable people generally, nor the immorality of the couples condemned to celibacy by separation orders which do not annul their marriages, but the fall in the birth rate. Public opinion will not help us out of this difficulty. On the contrary, it will, if it be allowed, punish anybody who mentions it. When tried to repopulate France by writing a novel in praise of parentage, the only comment made here was that the book could not possibly be translated into English, as its subject was too improper. The limits of democracy. Now, if England had been governed in the past by statesmen willing to be ruled by such public opinion as that, she would have been wiped off the political map long ago. The modern notion that democracy means governing a country according to the ignorance of its majorities is never more disastrous than when there is some question of sexual morals to be dealt with. The business of a democratic statesman is not, as some of us seem to think, to convince the voters that he knows no better than they as to the methods of attaining their common ends, but on the contrary to convince them that he knows much better than they do, and therefore differs from them on every possible question of method. The voter's duty is to take care that the government consists of men whom he can trust to devise or support institutions making for the common welfare. This is highly skilled work, and to be governed by people who set about it as the man in the street would set about it is to make straight for red ruin and the breaking up of laws. Voltaire said that everybody is wiser than anybody, and whether he is or not, it is his will that must prevail, but the will and the way are two very different things. For example, it is the will of the people on a hot day that the means of relief from the effects of the heat should be within the reach of everybody. Nothing could be more innocent, more hygienic, more important to the social welfare. But the way of the people on such occasions is mostly to drink large quantities of beer, or, among the more luxurious classes, iced claret cup, lemon squashes, and the like. To take a moral illustration, the will to suppress misconduct and secure efficiency in work is general and salutary, but the notion that the best and only effective way is by complaining, scolding, punishing, and revenging is equally general. When Mrs. opened an abscess on her pupil's head with an inky penknife, her object was entirely laudable, her heart was in the right place. A statesman interfering with her on the ground that he did not want the boy cured would have deserved impeachment for gross tyranny. But a statesman tolerating amateur surgical practice with inky penknives in school would be a very bad minister of education. It is on the question of method that your expert comes in, and though I am democrat enough to insist that he must first convince a representative body of amateurs that his way is the right way and Mrs. Sway the wrong way, yet I very strongly object to any tendency to flatter Mrs. into the belief that her way is in the least likely to be the right way, or that any other test is to be applied to it except the test of its effect on human welfare. The science and art of politics. Political science means nothing else than the devising of the best ways of fulfilling the will of the world, and I repeat, it is skilled work. Once the way is discovered, the methods laid down, and the machinery provided, the work of the statesman is done, and that of the official begins. To illustrate, there is no need for the police officer, who governs the street traffic to be, or to know any better than the people who obey the wave of his hand. All concerted action involves subordination and the appointment of directors, at whose signal the others will act. There is no more need for them to be superior to the rest than for the keystone of an arch to be of harder stone than the coping. But when it comes to devising the directions which are to be obeyed, that is, to making new institutions and scrapping old ones, then you need aristocracy in the sense of government by the best. A military state organized so as to carry out exactly the impulses of the average soldier would not last a year. The result of trying to make the Church of England reflect the notions of the average churchgoer has reduced it to a cipher, except for the purposes of a petulantly irreligious social and political club. Democracy as to the thing to be done may be inevitable, hence the vital need for a democracy of supermen, but democracy as to the way to do it is like letting the passengers drive the train. It can only end in collision and wreck. As a matter of act, we obtain reforms, such as they are, not by allowing the electorate to draft statutes, but by persuading it that a certain minister and his cabinet are gifted with sufficient political sagacity to find out how to produce the desired result. And the usual penalty of taking advantage of this power to reform our institutions is defeat by a vehement swing of the pendulum at the next election. Therein lies the peril and the glory of democratic statesmanship. A statesman who confines himself to popular legislation, or, for the matter of that, a playwright who confines himself to popular plays, is like a blind man's dog who goes wherever the blind man pulls him, on the ground that both of them want to go to the same place. Why statesmen shirk the marriage question. The reform of marriage, then, will be a very splendid and very hazardous adventure for the Prime Minister who takes it in hand. He will be posted on every hoarding and denounced in every opposition paper, especially in the sporting papers, as the destroyer of the home, the family, of decency, of morality, of chastity, and whatnot. All the commonplaces of the modern anti-socialist Noodles oration will be hurled at him. And he will have to proceed without the slightest concession to it, giving the Noodles nothing but their due in the assurance, I know how to attain our ends better than you, and staking his political life on the conviction carried by that assurance, which conviction will depend a good deal on the certainty with which it is made, which again can be attained only by studying the facts of marriage and understanding the needs of the nation. And after all, he will find that the pious commonplaces on which he and the electorate are agreed conceal an utter difference in the real ends in view, his being public, farsighted, and impersonal, and those of multitudes of the electorate narrow, personal, jealous, and corrupt. Under such circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that the mere mention of the marriage question makes a British cabinet shiver with apprehension and hastily pass on to safer business. Nevertheless, the reform of marriage cannot be put off forever. When its hour comes, what are the points the cabinet will have to take up? The question of population. First, it will have to make up its mind as to how many people we want in the country. If we want less than at present, we must ascertain how many less, and if we allow the reduction to be made by the continued operation of the present sterilization of marriage, we must settle how the process is to be stopped when it has gone far enough. But if we desire to maintain the population at its present figure, or to increase it, we must take immediate steps to induce people of moderate means to marry earlier and to have more children. There is less urgency in the case of the very poor and the very rich. They breed recklessly, the rich because they can afford it, and the poor because they cannot afford the precautions by which the artisans and the middle classes avoid big families. Nevertheless, the population declines, because the high birth rate of the very poor is counterbalanced by a huge infantile mortality in the slums, whilst the very rich are also the very few, and are becoming sterilized by the spreading revolt of their women against excessive childbearing, sometimes against any childbearing. This last cause is important. It cannot be removed by any economic readjustment. If every family were provided with £10,000 a year tomorrow, women would still refuse more and more to continue bearing children until they are exhausted, whilst numbers of others are bearing no children at all. Even if every woman bearing and rearing a valuable child received a handsome series of payments, thereby making motherhood a real profession as it ought to be, the number of women able or willing to give more of their lives to gestation and nursing than 3 or 4 children would cost them might not be very large if the advance in social organization and conscience indicated by such payments involved also the opening up of other means of livelihood to women. And it must be remembered that urban civilization itself, insofar as it is a method of evolution, and when it is not this, it is simply a nuisance, is a sterilizing process as far as numbers go. It is harder to keep up the supply of elephants than of sparrows and rabbits, and for the same reason it will be harder to keep up the supply of highly cultivated men and women than it now is of agricultural laborers. Bees get out of this difficulty by a special system of feeding, which enables a queen bee to produce 4,000 eggs a day whilst the other females lose their sex altogether and become workers supporting the males in luxury and idleness until the queen has found her mate, when the queen kills him and the quondam females kill all the rest. Such at least are the accounts given by romantic naturalists of the matter. The right to motherhood. This system certainly shows a much higher development of social intelligence than our marriage system, but if it were physically possible to introduce it into human society, it would be wrecked by an opposite and not less important revolt of women, that is, the revolt against compulsory barrenness. In this, two classes of women are concerned: those who, though they have no desire for the presence or care of children, nevertheless feel that motherhood is an experience necessary to their complete psychical development and understanding of themselves and others, and those who, though unable to find or unwilling to entertain a husband, would like to occupy themselves with the rearing of children. My own experience of discussing this question leads me to believe that the one point on which all women are in furious secret rebellion against the existing law is the saddling of the right to a child with the obligation to become the servant of a man. Adoption, or the begging or buying or stealing of another woman's child, is no remedy. It does not provide the supreme experience of bearing the child. No political constitution will ever succeed or deserve to succeed unless it includes the recognition of an absolute right to sexual experience, and is untainted by the Pauline or romantic view of such experience as sinful in itself. And since this experience in its fullest sense must be carried in the case of women to the point of childbearing, it can only be reconciled with the acceptance of marriage with the child's father by legalizing polygyny, because there are more adult women in the country than men. Now, though polygyny prevails throughout the greater part of the British Empire and is as practicable here as in India, there is a good deal to be said against it, and still more to be felt. However, let us put our feelings aside for a moment and consider the question politically. Monogamy, polygyny, and polyandry. The number of wives permitted to a single husband or of husbands to a single wife under a marriage system is not an ethical problem. It depends solely on the proportion of the sexes in the population. If in consequence of a great war 3/4 of the men in this country were killed, it would be absolutely necessary to adopt the allowance of 4 wives to each man in order to recruit the population. The fundamental reason for not allowing women to risk their lives in battle and for giving them the first chance of escape in all dangerous emergencies, in short, for treating their lives as more valuable than male lives, is not in the least a chivalrous reason, though men may consent to it under the illusion of chivalry. It is a simple matter of necessity, for if a large proportion of women were killed or disabled, no possible readjustment of our marriage law could avert the depopulation and consequent political ruin of the country, because a woman with several husbands bears fewer children than a woman with one, whereas a man can produce as many families as he has wives. The natural foundation of the institution of monogamy is not any inherent viciousness in polygyny or polyandry, but the hard fact that men and women are born in about equal numbers. Unfortunately, we kill so many of our male children in infancy that we are left with a surplus of adult women which is sufficiently large to claim attention, and yet not large enough to enable every man to have 2 wives. Even if it were, we should be met by an economic difficulty. A Kaffir is rich in proportion to the number of his wives, because the women are the breadwinners. But in our civilization, women are not paid for their social work in the bearing and rearing of children and the ordering of households. They are quartered on the wages of their husbands. At least 4 out of 5 of our men could not afford 2 wives unless their wages were nearly doubled. Would it not then be well to try unlimited polygyny, so that the remaining 5th could have as many wives apiece as they could afford? Let us see how this would work. The male revolt against polygyny. Experience shows that women do not object to polygyny when it is customary. On the contrary, they are its most ardent supporters. The reason is obvious. The question, as it presents itself in practice to a woman, is whether it is better to have, say, a whole share in a 10th-rate man or a 10th share in a first-rate man. Substitute the word income for the word man, and you will have the question as it presents itself economically to the dependent woman. The woman whose instincts are maternal, who desires superior children more than anything else, never hesitates. She would take 1,000th share, if necessary, in a husband who is a man in 1,000, rather than have some comparatively weedy weakling all to herself. It is the comparatively weedy weakling, left mateless by polygyny, who objects. Thus, it was not the women of Salt Lake City, nor even of America, who attacked Mormon polygyny. It was the men, and very naturally. On the other hand, women object to polyandry, because polyandry enables the best women to monopolize all the men, just as polygyny enables the best men to monopolize all the women. That is why all our ordinary men and women are unanimous in defense of monogamy, the men because it excludes polygyny, and the women because it excludes polyandry. The women left to themselves would tolerate polygyny. The men left to themselves would tolerate polyandry. But polygyny would condemn a great many men, and polyandry a great many women, to the celibacy of neglect. Hence the resistance any attempt to establish unlimited polygyny always provokes, not from the best people, but from the mediocrities and the inferiors. If we could get rid of our inferiors and screw up our average quality until mediocrity ceased to be a reproach, thus making every man reasonably eligible as a father and every woman reasonably desirable as a mother, polygyny and polyandry would immediately fall into sincere disrepute, because monogamy is so much more convenient and economical that nobody would want to share a husband or a wife if he or she could have a sufficiently good one all to himself or herself. Thus it appears that it is the scarcity of husbands or wives of high quality that leads women to polygyny and men to polyandry, and that if this scarcity were cured, monogamy, in the sense of having only one husband or wife at a time, facilities for changing are another matter, would be found satisfactory. Difference between Oriental and Occidental polygyny. It may now be asked why the nations have not gravitated to monogamy, like the Latter-day Saints of Salt Lake City. The answer is not far to seek. Their polygyny is limited. By the law, a man cannot marry more than 4 wives, and by the unwritten law of necessity, no man can keep more wives than he can afford, so that a man with 4 wives must be quite as exceptional in Asia as a man with a carriage and pair or a motor car is in Europe, where nevertheless we may all have as many carriages and motors as we can afford to pay for. Polygyny, though unlimited, is not really a popular institution. If you are a person of high caste, you pay another person of very august caste indeed to make your daughter momentarily one of his 60 or 70 momentary wives for the sake of ennobling your, but this fashion of a small and intensely snobbish class is negligible as a general precedent. In any case, men and women in the East do not marry anyone they fancy, as in England and America. Women are secluded and marriages are arranged. In Salt Lake City, the free woman could see and meet the ablest man of the community, and tempt him to make her his 10th wife by all the arts peculiar to women in English-speaking countries. No Eastern woman can do anything of the sort. The man alone has any initiative, but he has no access to the woman. Besides, as we have seen, the difficulty created by male license is not polygyny but polyandry, which is not allowed. Consequently, if we are to make polygyny a success, we must limit it. If we have 2 women to every 1 man, we must allow each man only 2 wives. That is simple, but unfortunately our own actual proportion is, roughly, something like 11 women to 1 man. Now you cannot enact that each man shall be allowed 11 wives, or that each woman who cannot get a husband all to herself shall divide herself between 11 already married husbands. Thus there is no way out for us through polygyny. There is no way at all out of the present system of condemning the superfluous women to barrenness, except by legitimizing the children of women who are not married to the fathers. The old maid's right to motherhood. Now the right to bear children without taking a husband could not be confined to women who are superfluous in the monogamic reckoning. There is the practical difficulty that although in our population there are about 1 million superfluous women, yet it is quite impossible to say of any given unmarried woman that she is one of the superfluous. And there is the difficulty of principle. The right to bear a child, perhaps the most sacred of all women's rights, is not one that should have any conditions attached to it except in the interests of race welfare. There are many women of admirable character, strong, capable, independent, who dislike the domestic habits of men, have no natural turn for mothering and coddling them, and find the concession of conjugal rights to any person under any conditions intolerable by their self-respect. Yet the general sense of the community recognizes in these very women the fittest people to have charge of children, and trusts them, as school mistresses and matrons of institutions, more than women of any other type when it is possible to procure them for such work. Why should the taking of a husband be imposed on these women as the price of their right to maternity? I am quite unable to answer that question. I see a good deal of first-rate maternal ability and sagacity spending itself on bees and poultry and village schools and cottage hospitals, and I find myself repeatedly asking myself why this valuable strain in the national breed should be sterilized. Unfortunately, the very women whom we should tempt to become mothers for the good of the race are the very last people to press their services on their country in that way. Plato long ago pointed out the importance of being governed by men with sufficient sense of responsibility and comprehension of public duties to be very reluctant to undertake the work of governing. And yet we have taken his instructions so little to heart that we are at present suffering acutely from government by who will stoop to all the mean shifts of electioneering and incur all its heavy expenses for the sake of a seat in Parliament. But what our sentimentalists have not yet been told is that exactly the same thing applies to maternity as to government. The best mothers are not those who are so enslaved by their primitive instincts that they will bear children no matter how hard the conditions are, but precisely those who place a very high price on their services and are quite prepared to become old maids if the price is refused, and even to feel relieved at their escape. Our democratic and matrimonial institutions may have their merits. At all events, they are mostly reforms of something worse, but they put a premium on want of self-respect in certain very important matters, and the consequence is that we are very badly governed and are, on the whole, an ugly, mean, ill-bred race.
A chain stitch.
Let us not forget, however, in our sympathy for the superfluous women, that their children must have fathers as well as mothers. Who are the fathers to be? All monogamists and married women will reply hastily, either bachelors or widowers, and this solution will serve as well as another, for it would be hypocritical to pretend that the difficulty is a practical one. Nonetheless, the monogamists, after due reflection, will point out that if there are widowers enough, the superfluous women are not really superfluous, and therefore there is no reason why the parties should not marry respectably like other people. And they might in that case be right if the reasons were purely numerical. That is, if every woman were willing to take a husband if one could be found for her, and every man willing to take a wife on the same terms. Also, please remember, if widows would remain celibate to give the unmarried women a chance. These ifs will not work. We must recognize two classes of old maids. One, the really superfluous women, and the other, the women who refuse to accept maternity on the to them unbearable condition of taking a husband. From both classes may, perhaps, be subtracted for the present the large proportion of women who could not afford the extra expense of one or more children. I say perhaps because it is by no means sure that within reasonable limits mothers do not make a better fight for subsistence, and have not, on the whole, a better time than single women. In any case, we have two distinct cases to deal with, the superfluous and the voluntary, and it is the voluntary whose grit we are most concerned to fertilize. But here again we cannot put our finger on any particular case and pick out Miss as superfluous and Miss Wilkinson's as voluntary. Whether we legitimize the child of the unmarried woman as a duty to the superfluous or as a bribe to the voluntary, the practical result must be the same, to wit, that the condition of marriage now attached to legitimate parentage will be withdrawn from all women, and fertile unions outside marriage recognized by society. Now clearly the consequences would not stop there. The strong-minded ladies who are resolved to be mistresses in their own houses would not be the only ones to take advantage of the new law. Even women to whom a home without a man in it would be no home at all, and who fully intended, if the man turned out to be the right one, to live with him exactly as married couples live, would, if they were possessed of independent means, have every inducement to adopt the new conditions instead of the old ones. Only the women whose sole means of livelihood was wifehood would insist on marriage. Hence a tendency would set in to make marriage more and more one of the customs imposed by necessity on the poor, whilst the freer form of union, regulated, no doubt, by settlements and private contracts of various kinds, would become the practice of the rich, that is, would become the fashion. At which point nothing but the achievement of economic independence by women, which is already seen clearly ahead of us, would be needed to make marriage disappear altogether, not by formal abolition, but by simple disuse. The private contract stage of this process was reached in ancient Rome. The only practicable alternative to it seems to be such an extension of divorce as will reduce the risks and obligations of marriage to a degree at which they will be no worse than those of the alternatives to marriage. As we shall see, this is the solution to which all the arguments tend. Meanwhile, note how much reason a statesman has to pause before meddling with an institution which, unendurable as its drawbacks are, threatens to come to pieces in all directions if a single thread of it be cut. Similitude of the machine-made chain stitch, which unravels the whole seam at the first pull when a single stitch is ripped, is very applicable to the knot of marriage. Remoteness of the facts from the ideal. But before we allow this to deter us from touching the sacred fabric, we must find out whether it is not already coming to pieces in all directions by the continuous strain of circumstances. No doubt, if it were all that it pretends to be, and human nature were working smoothly within its limits, there would be nothing more to be said. It would be let alone as it always is let alone during the cruder stages of civilization. But the moment we refer to the facts, we discover that the ideal matrimony and domesticity which our bigots implore us to preserve as the cornerstone of our society is a figment. What we have really got is something very different, questionable at its best and abominable at its worst. The word pure so commonly applied to it by thoughtless people is absurd, because if they do not mean celibate by it, they mean nothing, and if they do mean celibate, then marriage is legalized impurity, a conclusion which is offensive and inhuman. Marriage as a fact is not in the least like marriage as an ideal. If it were, the sudden changes which have been made on the continent from indissoluble Roman Catholic marriage to marriage that can be dissolved by a box on the ear as in France, by an epithet as in Germany, or simply at the wish of both parties as in Sweden, not to mention the experiments made by some of the American states, would have shaken society to its foundations. Yet they have produced so little effect that Englishmen open their eyes in surprise when told of their existence. Difficulty of obtaining evidence. As to what actual marriage is, one would like evidence instead of guesses, but as all departures from the ideal are regarded as disgraceful, evidence cannot be obtained, for when the whole community is indicted, nobody will go into the witness box for the prosecution. Some guesses we can make with some confidence. For example, if it be objected to any change that our bachelors and widowers would no longer be Galahads, we may without extravagance or cynicism reply that many of them are not Galahads now, and that the only change would be that hypocrisy would no longer be compulsory. Indeed, this can hardly be called guessing. The evidence is in the streets. But when we attempt to find out the truth about our marriages, we cannot even guess with any confidence. Speaking for myself, I can say that I know the inside history of perhaps half a dozen marriages. Any family solicitor knows more than this, but even a family solicitor, however large his practice, knows nothing of the million households which have no solicitors, and which nevertheless make marriage what it really is. And all he can say comes to no more than I can say, to wit, that no marriage of which I have any knowledge is in the least like the ideal marriage. I do not mean that it is worse, I mean simply that it is different. Also, far from society being organized in a defense of its ideal so jealous and implacable that the least step from the straight path means exposure and ruin, it is almost impossible by any extravagance of misconduct to provoke society to relax its steady of blindness, unless you do one or both of two fatal things. One is to get into the newspapers, and the other is to confess. If you confess misconduct to respectable men or women, they must either disown you or become virtually your accomplices. That is why they are so angry with you for confessing. If you get into the papers, the of not knowing becomes impossible. But it is hardly too much to say that if you avoid these two perils, you can do anything you like, as far as your neighbors are concerned. And since we can hardly flatter ourselves that this is the effect of charity, it is difficult not to suspect that our extraordinary forbearance in the matter of stone throwing is that suggested in the well-known parable of the women taken in adultery, which some early freethinker slipped into the gospel of John, namely, that we all live in glass houses. We may take it, then, that the ideal husband and the ideal wife are no more real human beings than the cherubim. Possibly the great majority keeps its marriage vows in the technical divorce court sense. No husband or wife, yet born, keeps them or ever can keep them in the ideal sense. Marriage as a magic spell. The truth which people seem to overlook in this matter is that the marriage ceremony is quite useless as a magic spell for changing in an instant the nature of the relations of two human beings to one another. If a man marries a woman after 3 weeks' acquaintance, and the day after meets a woman he has known for 20 years, he finds, sometimes to his own irrational surprise and his wife's equally irrational indignation, that his wife is a stranger to him, and the other woman an old friend. Also, there is no hocus that can possibly be devised with rings and veils and vows and benedictions that can fix either a man's or woman's affection for 20 minutes, much less 20 years. Even the most affectionate couples must have moments during which they are far more conscious of one another's faults than of one another's attractions. There are couples who dislike one another furiously for several hours at a time. There are couples who dislike one another permanently, and there are couples who never dislike one another. But these last are people who are incapable of disliking anybody. If they do not quarrel, it is not because they are married, but because they are not quarrelsome. The people who are quarrelsome quarrel with their husbands and wives just as easily as with their servants and relatives and acquaintances. Marriage makes no difference. Those who talk and write and legislate as if all this could be prevented by making solemn vows that it shall not happen are either insincere, insane, or hopelessly stupid. There is some sense in a contract to perform or abstain from actions that are reasonably within voluntary control, but such contracts are only needed to provide against the possibility of either party being no longer desirous of the performance or abstention. A person proposing or accepting a contract not only to do something, but to like doing it would be certified as mad. Yet popular superstition credits the wedding rite with the power of fixing our fancies or affections for life, even under the most unnatural conditions. The impersonality of sex. It is necessary to lay some stress on these points, because few realize the extent to which we proceed on the assumption that marriage is a shortcut to perfect and permanent intimacy and affection. But there is a still more unworkable assumption which must be discarded before discussions of marriage can get into any sort of touch with the facts of life. That assumption is that the specific relation which marriage authorizes between the parties is the most intimate and personal of human relations, and embraces all the other high human relations. Now this is violently untrue. Every adult knows that the relation in question can and does exist between entire strangers, different in language, color, tastes, class, civilization, morals, religion, character, in everything, in short, except their bodily homology and the reproductive appetite common to all living organisms. Even hatred, cruelty, and contempt are not incompatible with it, and jealousy and murder are as near to it as affectionate friendship. It is true that it is a relation beset with wildly extravagant illusions for inexperienced people, and that even the most experienced people have not always sufficient analytic faculty to disentangle it from the sentiments, sympathetic or abhorrent, which may spring up through the other relations which are compulsorily attached to it by our laws or sentimentally associated with it in romance. But the fact remains that the most disastrous marriages are those founded exclusively on it, and the most successful those in which it has been least considered, and in which the decisive considerations have had nothing to do with sex, such as liking, money, congeniality of tastes, similarity of habits, suitability of class, etc. etc. It is no doubt necessary under existing circumstances for a woman without property to be sexually attractive, because she must get married to secure a livelihood, and the illusions of sexual attraction will cause the imagination of young men to endow her with every accomplishment and virtue that can make a wife a treasure. The attraction being thus constantly and ruthlessly used as a bait, both by individuals and by society, any discussion tending to strip it of its illusions and get at its real natural history is nervously discouraged. But nothing can well be more unwholesome for everybody than the exaggeration and glorification of an instinctive function which clouds the reason and upsets the judgment more than all the other instincts put together. The process may be pleasant and romantic, but the consequences are not. It would be far better for everyone, as well as far, if young people were taught that what they call love is an appetite which, like all other appetites, is destroyed for the moment by its gratification, that no profession, promise, or proposal made under its influence should bind anybody. and that its great natural purpose so completely transcends the personal interests of any individual or even of any 10 generations of individuals, that it should be held to be an act of prostitution, and even a sort of blasphemy to attempt to turn it to account by exacting a personal return for its gratification, whether by process of law or not. By all means let it be the subject of contracts with society as to its consequences, but to make marriage an open trade in it as at present, with money, board and lodging, personal slavery, vows of eternal exclusive personal sentimentalities and the rest of it as the price, is neither virtuous, dignified, nor decent. No husband ever secured his domestic happiness and honor, nor has any wife ever secured hers, by relying on it. No private claims of any sort should be founded on it. The real point of honor is to take no corrupt advantage of it. When we hear of young women being led astray and the like, we find that what has led them astray is a sedulously inculcated false notion that the relation they are tempted to contract is so intensely personal, and the vows made under the influence of its transient infatuation so sacred and enduring, that only an atrociously wicked man could make light of or forget them. What is more, as the same fantastic errors are inculcated in men, and the conscientious ones therefore feel bound in honor to stand by what they have promised, one of the methods to obtain a husband is to on his susceptibilities until he is either carried away into a promise of marriage to which he can be legally held, or else into an indiscretion, which he must repair by marriage on pain of having to regard himself as a scoundrel and a seducer. Besides facing the utmost damage the lady's relatives can do him. Such a transaction is not an entrance into a holy state of matrimony. It is as often as not the inauguration of a lifelong squabble, a corroding grudge that causes more misery and degradation of character than a dozen entirely natural desertions and betrayals. Yet the number of marriages affected more or less in this way must be enormous. When people say that love should be free, their words taken literally may be foolish, but they are only expressing inaccurately a very real need for the disentanglement of sexual relations from a mass of exorbitant and irrelevant conditions imposed on them on false to enable needy parents to get their daughters off their hands, and to keep those who are already married effectually enslaved by one another. The economic slavery of women. One of the consequences of basing marriage on the considerations, stated with cold abhorrence by St. in the 7th chapter of his epistle to the Corinthians, as being made necessary by the unlikeness of most men to himself, is that the sex slavery involved has become complicated by economic slavery, so that whilst the man defends marriage because he is really defending his pleasures, the woman is even more vehement on the same side because she is defending her only means of livelihood. To a woman without property or marketable talent, a husband is more necessary than a master to a dog. There is nothing more wounding to our sense of human dignity than the husband hunting that begins in every family when the daughters become marriageable, but it is inevitable under existing circumstances, and the parents who refuse to engage in it are bad parents, though they may be superior individuals. The cubs of a humane tigress would starve, and the daughters of women who cannot bring themselves to devote several years of their lives to the pursuit of sons-in-law often have to expiate their mother's squeamishness by lifelong celibacy and indigence. To ask a young man his intentions when you know he has no intentions, but is unable to deny that he has paid attentions, to threaten an action for breach of promise of marriage, to pretend that your daughter is a musician when she has with the greatest difficulty been coached into playing 3 pianoforte pieces which she loathes, to use your own mature charms to attract men to the house when your daughters have no aptitude for that department of sport, to coach them when they have in the arts by which men can be led to themselves, and to keep all the skeletons carefully locked up in the family cupboard until the prey is duly hunted down, and all this is a mother's duty today, and a very revolting duty it is, one that disposes of the conventional assumption that it is in the faithful discharge of her home duties that a woman finds her self-respect. The truth is that family life will never be decent, much less ennobling, until this central horror of the dependence of women on men is done away with. At present it reduces the difference between marriage and prostitution to the difference between trade unionism and unorganized casual labor, a huge difference, no doubt, as to order and comfort, but not a difference in kind. However, it is not by any reform of the marriage laws that this can be dealt with. It is in the general movement for the prevention of destitution that the means for making women independent of the compulsory sale of their persons, in marriage or otherwise, will be found. But meanwhile those who deal specifically with the marriage laws should never allow themselves for a moment to forget this abomination that plucks the rose from the fair forehead of an innocent love, and sets a blister there, and then calmly calls itself purity, home, motherhood, respectability, honor, decency, and any other fine name that happens to be convenient, not to mention the foul epithets it hurls freely at those who are ashamed of it. Unpopularity of impersonal views. Unfortunately, it is very hard to make an average citizen take impersonal views of any sort in matters affecting personal comfort or conduct. We may be enthusiastic liberals or conservatives without any hope of seats in parliament, knighthoods, or posts in the government, because party politics do not make the slightest difference in our daily lives and therefore cost us nothing. But to take a vital process in which we are keenly interested personal instruments, and ask us to regard it and feel about it and legislate on it wholly as if it were an impersonal one, is to make a higher demand than most people seem capable of responding to. We all have personal interests in marriage, which we are not prepared to sink. It is not only the women who want to get married. The men do too, sometimes on sentimental grounds, sometimes on the more sordid calculation that bachelor life is less comfortable and more expensive, since a wife pays for her status with domestic service as well as with the other services expected of her. Now that children are avoidable, this calculation is becoming more common and conscious than it was, a result which is regarded as a steady improvement in general morality. Impersonality is not promiscuity. There is, too, a really appalling prevalence of the superstition that the sexual instinct in men is utterly promiscuous, and that the least relaxation of law and custom must produce a wild outbreak of licentiousness. As far as our moralists can grasp the proposition that we should deal with the sexual relation as impersonal, it seems to them to mean that we should encourage it to be promiscuous, hence their recoil from it. But promiscuity and impersonality are not the same thing. No man ever fell in love with the entire female sex, nor any woman with the entire male sex. We often do not fall in love at all, and when we do, we fall in love with one person and remain indifferent to thousands of others who pass before our eyes every day. Selection, carried even to such fastidiousness as to induce people to say quite commonly that there is only one man or woman in the world for them, is the rule in nature. If anyone doubts this, let him open a shop for the sale of picture postcards, and when a lady customer demands a portrait of her favorite actor or a gentleman of his favorite actress, try to substitute some other portrait on the ground that since the sexual instinct is promiscuous, one portrait is as pleasing as another. I suppose no shopkeeper has ever been foolish enough to do such a thing, and yet all our shopkeepers, the moment a discussion arises on marriage, will passionately argue against all reform on the ground that nothing but the most severe coercion can save their wives and daughters from quite indiscriminate rapine.
Domestic change of air.
Our relief at the morality of the reassurance that man is not promiscuous in his fancies must not blind us to the fact that he is, to use the word coined by certain American writers to describe themselves, something of a. Even those who say there is only one man or woman in the world for them find that it is not always the same man or woman. It happens that our law permits us to study this phenomenon among entirely law-abiding people. I know one lady who has been married 5 times. She is, as might be expected, a wise, attractive, and interesting woman. The question is she wise, attractive, and interesting because she has been married 5 times, or has she been married 5 times because she is wise, attractive, and interesting? Probably some of the truth lies both ways. I also know of a household consisting of 3 families, a having married first B and then C, who afterwards married D. All 3 unions were fruitful, so that the children had a change both of fathers and mothers. Now I cannot honestly say that these and similar cases have convinced me that people are the worse for a change. The lady who has married and managed 5 husbands must be much more expert at it than most monogamic ladies, and as a companion, and she probably leaves them nowhere.
Mr. Question.
What can they know of England that only England know? Disposes not only of the patriots who are so patriotic that they never leave their own country to look at another, but of the citizens who are so domestic that they have never married again and never loved anyone except their own husbands and wives. The domestic doctrinaires are also the dull people. The impersonal relation of sex may be judicially reserved for one person, but any such reservation of friendship, affection, admiration, sympathy, and so forth is only possible to a wretchedly narrow and jealous nature, and neither history nor contemporary society shows us a single amiable and respectable character capable of it. This has always been recognized in cultivated society. That is why poor people accuse cultivated society of profligacy, poor people being often so ignorant and uncultivated that they have nothing to offer each other but the sex relationship, and cannot conceive why men and women should associate for any other purpose. As to the children of the triple household, they were not only on excellent terms with one another, and never thought of any distinction between their full and their half-brothers and sisters, but they had the superior sociability, which distinguishes the people who live in communities from those who live in small families. The inference is that changes of partners are not in themselves injurious or undesirable. People are not demoralized by them when they are effected according to law. Therefore, we need not hesitate to alter the law merely because the alteration would make such changes easier. Home manners are bad manners. On the other hand, we have all seen the bonds of marriage vilely abused by people who are never classed with shrews and wife-beaters. They are indeed sometimes held up as models of domesticity because they do not drink nor gamble, nor neglect their children, nor tolerate dirt and untidiness, and because they are not amiable enough to have what are called amiable weaknesses. These terrors conceive marriage as a dispensation from all the common civilities and delicacies which they have to observe among strangers, or, as they put it, before company. And here the effects of indissoluble marriage for better for worse are very plainly and disagreeably seen. If such people took their domestic manners into general society, they would very soon find themselves without a friend or even an acquaintance in the world. There are women who, through total disuse, have lost the power of kindly human speech and can only scold and complain. There are men who grumble and nag from inveterate habit even when they are comfortable. But their unfortunate spouses and children cannot escape from them. Spurious natural affection. What is more, they are protected from even such discomfort as the dislike of his prisoners may cause to by the hypnotism of the convention that the natural relation between husband and wife and parent and child is one of intense affection, and that to feel any other sentiment towards a member of one's family is to be a monster. Under the influence of the emotion thus manufactured, the most detestable people are spoilt with entirely undeserved deference, obedience, and even affection whilst they live, and mourned when they die by those whose lives they wantonly or maliciously made miserable. And this is what we call natural conduct. Nothing could well be less natural. That such a convention should have been established shows that the indissolubility of marriage creates such intolerable situations that only by the human imagination with a hypnotic suggestion of wholly unnatural feelings can it be made to keep up appearances. If the sentimental theory of family relationship encourages bad manners and personal slovenliness and uncleanness in the home, it also, in the case of sentimental people, encourages the practice of rousing and playing on the affections of children prematurely and far too frequently. The lady who says that as her religion is love, her children shall be brought up in an atmosphere of love, and institutes a system of sedulous endearments and exchanges of presents and conscious and studied acts of artificial kindness, may be defeated in a large family by the healthy derision and rebellion of children who have acquired hardihood and common sense in their conflicts with one another. But the small families, which are the rule just now, succumb more easily, and in the case of a single sensitive child the effect of being forced in a hothouse atmosphere of unnatural affection may be disastrous. In short, whichever way you take it, the convention that marriage and family relationship produces special feelings which alter the nature of human intercourse is a mischievous one. The whole difficulty of bringing up a family well is the difficulty of making its members behave as considerately at home as on a visit in a strange house, and as frankly, kindly, and easily in a strange house as at home. In the middle classes, where the segregation of the artificially limited family in its little brick box is horribly complete, bad manners, ugly dresses, awkwardness, cowardice, peevishness, and all the petty vices of unsociability flourish like mushrooms in a cellar. In the upper class, where families are not limited for money reasons, where at least 2 houses and sometimes 3 or 4 are the rule, not to mention the clubs, where there is traveling and hotel life, and where the men are brought up not in the family, but in public schools, universities, and the naval and military services, besides being constantly in social training in other people's houses, the result is to produce what may be called, in comparison with the middle class, something that might almost pass as a different and much more sociable species. And in the very class where people have no homes, only sleeping places, and consequently live practically in the streets, sociability again appears, leaving the middle class despised and disliked for its helpless and offensive unsociability as much by those below it as those above it, and yet ignorant enough to be proud of it, and to hold itself up as a model for the reform of the, as it considers, elegantly vicious rich and profligate poor alike. Carrying the war into the enemy's country. Without pretending to exhaust the subject, I have said enough to make it clear that the moment we lose the desire to defend our present matrimonial and family arrangements, there will be no difficulty in making out an overwhelming case against them. No doubt until then we shall continue to hold up the British home as the holy of holies in the temple of honorable motherhood, innocent childhood, manly virtue, and sweet and wholesome national life. But with a clever turn of the hand, this holy of holies can be exposed as an Augean stable, so filthy that it would seem more hopeful to burn it down than to attempt to sweep it out. And this latter view will perhaps prevail if the idolaters of marriage persist in refusing all proposals for reform and treating those who advocate it as infamous delinquents. Neither view is of any use except as a poisoned arrow in a fierce fight between two parties determined to discredit each other, with a view to obtaining powers of legal coercion over one another. Shelley and Queen Victoria. The best way to avert such a struggle is to open the eyes of the thoughtlessly conventional people to the weakness of their position in a mere contest of recrimination. Hitherto they have assumed that they have the advantage of coming into the field without a stain on their characters to combat libertines who have no character at all. They conceive it to be their duty to throw mud, and they feel that even if the enemy can find any mud to throw, none of it will stick. They are mistaken. There will be plenty of that sort of ammunition in the other camp, and most of it will stick very hard indeed. The moral is, do not throw any. If we can imagine Shelley and Queen Victoria arguing out their differences in another world, we may be sure that the Queen has long ago found that she cannot settle the question by classing Shelley with George IV as a bad man. And Shelley is not likely to have called her vile names on the general ground that as the economic dependence of women makes marriage a money bargain in which the man is the purchaser and the woman the purchased, there is no essential difference between a married woman and the woman of the streets. Unfortunately, all the people whose methods of controversy are represented by our popular newspapers are not Queen Victoria's and Shelley's. A great mass of them, when their prejudices are challenged, have no other impulse than to call the challenger names, and when the crowd seems to be on their side, to maltreat him personally or hand him over to the law if he is vulnerable to it. Therefore, I cannot say that I have any certainty that the marriage question will be dealt with decently and tolerantly. But dealt with it will be, decently or indecently, for the present state of things in England is too strained and mischievous to last. Europe and America have left us a century behind in this matter. A probable effect of giving women the vote. The political emancipation of women is likely to lead to a comparatively stringent enforcement by law of sexual morality. That is why so many of us dread it, and this will soon compel us to consider what our sexual morality shall be. At present, a ridiculous distinction is made between vice and crime, in order that men may be vicious with impunity. Adultery, for instance, though it is sometimes fiercely punished by giving an injured husband crushing damages in a divorce suit, injured wives are not considered in this way, is not now directly prosecuted, and this impunity extends to illicit relations between unmarried persons who have reached what is called the age of consent. There are other matters, such as notification of contagious disease and solicitation, in which the hand of the law has been brought down on one sex only. Outrages which were capital offenses within the memory of persons still living when committed on women outside marriage, can still be inflicted by men on their wives without legal remedy. At all such points the code will be screwed up by the operation of votes for women, if there be any virtue in the franchise at all. The result will be that men will find the more ascetic side of our sexual morality taken seriously by the law.
It is easy to foresee the consequences.
No man will take much trouble to alter laws which he can evade, or which are either not enforced or enforced on women only. But when these laws take him by the collar and thrust him into prison, he suddenly becomes keenly critical of them, and of the arguments by which they are supported. Now we have seen that our marriage laws will not stand criticism, and that they have held out so far only because they are so worked as to fit roughly our state of society, in which women are neither politically nor personally free, in which indeed women are called womanly only when they regard themselves as existing solely for the use of men. When enfranchises them politically, and socialism emancipates them economically, they will no longer allow the law to take immorality so easily. Both men and women will be forced to behave morally in sex matters, and when they find that this is inevitable, they will raise the question of what behavior really should be established as moral. If they decide in favor of our present professed morality, they will have to make a revolutionary change in their habits by becoming, in fact, what they only pretend to be at present. If, on the other hand, they find that this would be an unbearable tyranny, without even the excuse of justice or sound eugenics, they will reconsider their morality and remodel the law. The personal sentimental basis of monogamy. Monogamy has a sentimental basis, which is quite distinct from the political one of equal numbers of the sexes. Equal numbers in the sexes are quite compatible with a change of partners every day or every hour physically. There is nothing to distinguish human society from the farmyard, except that children are more troublesome and costly than chickens and calves, and that men and women are not so completely enslaved as farm stock. Accordingly, the people whose conception of marriage is a farmyard or slave quarter conception are always more or less in a panic, lest the slightest relaxation of the marriage laws should utterly demoralize society. Whilst those to whom marriage is a matter of more highly evolved sentiments and needs, sometimes said to be distinctively human, though birds and animals in a state of freedom evince them quite as touchingly as we, are much more liberal, knowing as they do that monogamy will take care of itself provided the parties are free enough, and that promiscuity is a product of slavery and not of liberty. The solid foundation of their confidence is the fact that the relationship set up by a comfortable marriage is so intimate and so persuasive of the whole life of the parties to it, that nobody has room in his or her life for more than one such relationship at a time. What is called a household of three is never really of three, except in the sense that every household becomes a household of three when a child is born, and may in the same way become a household of 4 or 14 if the union be fertile enough. Now, no doubt the marriage tie means so little to some people that the addition to the household of half a dozen more wives or husbands would be as possible as the addition of half a dozen governesses or tutors or visitors or servants. A sultan may have 50 wives as easily as he may have 50 dishes on his table, because in the English sense he has no wives at all, nor have his wives any husband. In short, he is not what we call a married man. And there are sultans and sultanas and seraglios existing in England under English forms. But when you come to the real modern marriage of sentiment, a relation is created which has never to my knowledge been shared by 3 persons, except when all 3 have been extraordinarily fond of one another. Take, for example, the famous case of Nelson and Sir William and Lady Hamilton. The secret of this household of 3 was not only that both the husband and Nelson were devoted to Lady Hamilton, but that they were also apparently devoted to one another. When Hamilton died, both Nelson and Emma seemed to have been equally heartbroken. When there is a successful household of 1 man and 2 women, the same unusual condition is fulfilled. The 2 women not only cannot live happily without the man, but cannot live happily without each other. In every other case known to me, either from observation or record, the experiment is a hopeless failure. One of the 2 rivals for the really intimate affection of the third inevitably drives out the other. The driven-out party may accept the situation and remain in the house as a friend to save appearances, or for the sake of the children, or for economic reasons. But such an arrangement can subsist only when the forfeited relation is no longer really valued, and this indifference, like the triple bond of affection which carried Sir William Hamilton through, is so rare as to be practicably negligible in the establishment of a conventional morality of marriage. Therefore, sensible and experienced people always assume that when a declaration of love is made to an already married person, the declaration binds the parties in honor never to see one another again unless they contemplate divorce and remarriage. And this is a sound convention, even for unconventional people. Let me illustrate by reference to a fictitious case. The one imagined in my own play Candida will do as well as another. Here a young man who has been received as a friend into the house of a clergyman falls in love with the clergyman's wife, and being young and inexperienced, declares his feelings, and claims that he, and not the clergyman, is the more suitable mate for the lady. The clergyman who has a temper is first tempted to hurl the youth into the street by bodily violence, an impulse natural, perhaps, but vulgar and improper, and not open on consideration to decent men. Even coarse and inconsiderate men are restrained from it by the fact that the sympathy of the woman turns naturally to the victim of physical brutality and against the bully, the notion to the contrary being one of the illusions of literary masculinity. Besides, the husband is not necessarily the stronger man. An appeal to force has resulted in the ignominious defeat of the husband quite as often as in poetic justice as conceived in the conventional. What an honorable and sensible man does when his household is invaded is what the Reverend James does in my play. He recognizes that just as there is not room for two women in that sacredly intimate relation of sentimental domesticity, which is what marriage means to him, so there is no room for two men in that relation with his wife, and he accordingly tells her firmly that she must choose which man will occupy the place that is large enough for one only. He is so far shrewdly unconventional as to recognize that if she chooses the other man, he must give way, legal tie or no legal tie, but he knows that either one or the other must go. And a sensible wife would act in the same way. If a romantic young lady came into her house and proposed to adore her husband on a tolerated footing, she would say, "My husband has not room in his life for two wives. Either you go out of the house or I go out of it." The situation is not at all unlikely. I had almost said not at all unusual. Young ladies, and in the condition which is called calf love, associating with married couples at dangerous periods of mature life, quite often find themselves in it, and the extreme reluctance of proud and sensitive people to avoid any assertion of matrimonial rights or to condescend to jealousy sometimes makes the threatened husband or wife hesitate to take prompt steps and do the apparently conventional thing. But whether they hesitate or act, the result is always the same. In a real marriage of sentiment, the wife or husband cannot be supplanted by halves, and such a marriage will break very soon under the strain of polygyny or polyandry. What we want at present is a sufficiently clear teaching of this fact to ensure that prompt and decisive action shall always be taken in such cases without any false shame of seeming conventional, a shame to which people capable of such real marriage are specially susceptible, and a rational divorce law to enable the marriage to be dissolved and the parties honorably resorted and recoupled without disgrace and scandal, if that should prove the proper solution. It must be repeated here that no law, however stringent, can prevent polygamy among groups of people who choose to live loosely and be monogamous only in appearance. But such cases are not now under consideration. Also, affectionate husbands like Samuel and affectionate wives of the corresponding temperaments may, it appears, engage in transient casual adventures out of doors without breaking up their home life. But within doors that home life may be regarded as naturally monogamous. It does not need to be protected against polygamy, it protects itself. Divorce. All this has an important bearing on the question of divorce. Divorce reformers are so much preoccupied with the injustice of forbidding a woman to divorce her husband for unfaithfulness to his marriage vow, whilst allowing him that power over her, that they are apt to overlook the pressing need for admitting other and far more important grounds for divorce. If we take a document like diary, we learn that a woman may have an incorrigibly unfaithful husband, and yet be much better off than if she had an ill-tempered, peevish, maliciously sarcastic one, or was chained for life to a criminal, a drunkard, a lunatic, an idle vagrant, or a person whose religious faith was contrary to her own. Imagine being married to a liar, a borrower, a mischief-maker, a teaser or tormentor of children and animals, or even simply to a bore. Conceive yourself tied for life to one of the perfectly faithful husbands who are sentenced to a month's imprisonment occasionally for idly leaving their wives in childbirth without food, fire, or attendance. What woman would not rather marry 10? What man a dozen Nell? Adultery, far from being the first and only ground for divorce, might more reasonably be made the last, or wholly excluded. The present law is perfectly logical only if you once admit, as no decent person ever does, its fundamental assumption that there can be no companionship between men and women because the woman has a sphere of her own, that of housekeeping, in which the man must not meddle, whilst he has all the rest of human activity for his sphere, the only point at which the two spheres touch being that of replenishing the population. On this assumption, the man naturally asks for a guarantee that the children shall be his, because he has to find the money to support them. The power of divorcing a woman for adultery is this guarantee, a guarantee that she does not need to protect her against a similar imposture on his part because he cannot bear children. No doubt he can spend the money that ought to be spent on her children on another woman and her children, but this is desertion, which is a separate matter. The fact for us to seize is that in the eye of the law, adultery without consequences is merely a sentimental grievance, whereas the planting on one man of another man's offspring is a substantial one. And so, no doubt, it is. But the day has gone by for basing laws on the assumption that a woman is less to a man than his dog, and thereby encouraging and accepting the standards of the husbands who buy meat for their bullpups and leave their wives and children hungry. That basis is the penalty we pay for having borrowed our religion from the East, instead of building up a religion of our own out of our Western inspiration and Western sentiment. The result is that we all believe that our religion is on its last legs, whereas the truth is that it is not yet born, though the age walks visibly pregnant with it. Meanwhile, as women are dragged down by their oriental servitude to our men, and as further women drag down those who degrade them quite as effectually as men do, there are moments when it is difficult to see anything in our sex institutions except a police, keeping the field for a competition as to which sex shall corrupt the other most. Importance of sentimental grievance. Any tolerable Western divorce law must put the sentimental grievances first, and should carefully avoid singling out any ground of divorce in such a way as to create a convention that persons having that ground are bound in honor to avail themselves of it. It is generally admitted that people should not be encouraged to petition for a divorce in a fit of petulance. What is not so clearly seen is that neither should they be encouraged to petition in a fit of jealousy, which is certainly the most detestable and mischievous of all the passions that enjoy public credit. Still less should people who are not jealous be urged to behave as if they were jealous, and to enter upon duels and divorce suits in which they have no desire to be successful. There should be no publication of the grounds on which a divorce is sought or granted, and as this would abolish the only means the public now has of ascertaining that every possible effort has been made to keep the couple united against their wills, such privacy will only be tolerated when we at last admit that the sole and sufficient reason why people should be granted a divorce is that they want one. Then there will be no more reports of divorce cases, no more letters read in court with an indelicacy that makes every sensitive person shudder and recoil as from a profanation, no more washing of household linen, dirty or clean, in public. We must learn in these matters to mind our own business and not impose our individual notions of propriety on one another, even if it carries us to the length of openly admitting what we are now compelled to assume silently, that every human being has a right to sexual experience, and that the law is concerned only with parentage, which is now a separate matter. Divorce without asking why. The one question that should never be put to a petitioner for divorce is why. When a man appeals to a magistrate for protection from someone who threatens to kill him, on the simple ground that he desires to live, the magistrate might quite reasonably ask him why he desires to live, and why the person who wishes to kill him should not be. Also, whether he can prove that his life is a pleasure to himself or a benefit to anyone else, and whether it is good for him to be encouraged to exaggerate the importance of his short span in this vale of tears, rather than to keep himself constantly ready to meet his God. The only reason for not raising these very weighty points is that we find society unworkable, except on the assumption that every man has a natural right to live. Nothing short of his own refusal to respect that right in others can reconcile the community to killing him. From this fundamental right, many others are derived. The American Constitution, one of the few modern political documents drawn up by men who were forced by the sternest circumstances to think out what they really had to face instead of chopping logic in a university classroom, specifies liberty and the pursuit of happiness as natural rights. The terms are too vague to be of much practical use, for the supreme right to life, extended as it now must be to the life of the race, and to the quality of life as well as to the mere fact of breathing, is making short work of many ancient liberties, and exposing the pursuit of happiness as perhaps the most miserable of human occupations. Nevertheless, the American Constitution roughly expresses the conditions to which modern democracy commits us. To impose marriage on two unmarried people who do not desire to marry one another would be admittedly an act of enslavement. But it is no worse than to impose a continuation of marriage on people who have ceased to desire to be married. It will be said that the parties may not agree on that, that one may desire to maintain the marriage the other wishes to dissolve. But the same hardship arises whenever a man in love proposes marriage to a woman and is refused. The refusal is so painful to him that he often threatens to kill himself and sometimes even does it. Yet we expect him to face his ill luck and never dream of forcing the woman to accept him. His case is the same as that of the husband whose wife tells him she no longer cares for him and desires the marriage to be dissolved. You will say, perhaps, if you are superstitious, that it is not the same, that marriage makes a difference. You are wrong. There is no magic in marriage. If there were, married couples would never desire to separate. But they do. And when they do, it is simple slavery to compel them to remain together. Economic slavery, again the root difficulty. The husband then is to be allowed to discard his wife when he is tired of her, and the wife the husband when another man strikes her fancy. One must reply unhesitatingly in the affirmative, for if we are to deny every proposition that can be stated in offensive terms by its opponents, we shall never be able to affirm anything at all. But the question reminds us that until the economic independence of women is achieved, we shall have to remain impaled on the other horn of the dilemma and maintain marriage as a slavery. And here let me ask the government of the day, 1910, a question with regard to the labor exchanges it has very wisely established throughout the country. What do these exchanges do when a woman enters and states that her occupation is that of a wife and mother, that she is out of a job, and that she wants an employer? If the exchanges refuse to entertain her application, they are clearly excluding nearly the whole female sex from the benefit of the act. If not, they must become matrimonial agencies, unless, indeed, they are prepared to become something worse by putting the woman down as a housekeeper and introducing her to an employer without making marriage a condition of the hiring. Labor exchanges and the white slavery. Suppose, again, a woman presents herself at the labor exchange and states her trade as that of a white slave, meaning the unmentionable trade pursued by many thousands of women in all civilized cities. Will the labor exchange find employers for her? If not, what will it do with her? If it throws her back destitute and unhelped on the streets to starve, it might as well not exist as far as she is concerned, and the problem of unemployment remains unsolved at its most painful point. Yet if it finds honest employment for her, and for all the unemployed wives and mothers, it must find new places in the world for women, and in so doing it must achieve for them economic independence of men. And when this is done, can we feel sure that any woman will consent to be a wife and mother, not to mention the less respectable alternative, unless her position is made as eligible as that of the women for whom the labor exchanges are finding independent work? Will not many women now engaged in domestic work under circumstances which make it repugnant to them, abandon it and seek employment under other circumstances? As unhappiness in marriage is almost the only discomfort sufficiently irksome to induce a woman to break up her home, and economic dependence the only compulsion sufficiently stringent to force her to endure such unhappiness, the solution of the problem of finding independent employment for women may cause a great number of childless, unhappy marriages to break up spontaneously, whether the marriage laws are altered or not. And here we must extend the term childless marriages to cover households in which the children have grown up and gone their own way, leaving the parents alone together, a point at which many worthy couples discover for the first time that they have long since lost interest in one another and have been united only by a common interest in their children. We may expect then that marriages which are maintained by economic pressure alone will dissolve when that pressure is removed, and as all the parties to them will certainly not accept a celibate life, the law must sanction the dissolution in order to prevent a recurrence of the scandal which has moved the government to appoint the commission now sitting to investigate the marriage question. The scandal, that is, of a great number of persons, condemned to celibacy by magisterial separation orders, and of course refusing to submit to the condemnation, forming illicit connections to an extent which threatens to familiarize the working classes with an open disuse of marriage. In short, once set women free from their economic slavery, and you will find that unless divorce is made as easy as the dissolution of a business partnership, the practice of dispensing with marriage will presently become so common that conventional couples will be ashamed to get married. Divorce favorable to marriage. Divorce, in fact, is not the destruction of marriage, but the first condition of its maintenance. 1,000 indissoluble marriages mean 1,000 marriages and no more. 1,000 divorces may mean 2,000 marriages, for the couples may marry again. Divorce only reassorts the couples, a very desirable thing when they are ill-assorted. Also, it makes people much more willing to marry, especially if prudent people and proud people with a high sense of self-respect. Further, the fact that a divorce is possible often prevents its being petitioned for, not only because it puts married couples on their good behavior towards one another, but because, as no room feels like a prison if the door is left open, the removal of the sense of bondage would at once make marriage much happier than it is now. Also, if the door were always open, there would be no need to rush through, as there is now when it opens for one moment in a lifetime, and may never open again. From this point of view, England has the worst civil marriage law in the world, with the exception of silly South Carolina. In every other reasonably civilized country, the grounds on which divorce can be granted admit of so wide an interpretation that all unhappy marriages can be dissolved without resorting to the shameful shifts imposed by our law. Yet the figures just given to the Royal Commission show that in the state of Washington, where there are 11 different grounds of divorce, and where in fact divorce can be had for the asking at a negligible cost, the divorce rate is only 184 per 100,000 of the population, which, if we assume that the 100,000 people represent 20,000 families, means less than 1% of domestic failures. In Japan, the rate is 215, which is said to be the highest on record. This is not very alarming. What is quite hideous is that the rate in England is only 2, a figure which, if we assume that human nature is much the same as in Washington, must represent a frightful quantity of useless unhappiness and clandestine polygamy. I am not forgetting my own demonstration that the rate is kept down in Washington by the economic slavery of women, but I must point out that this is at its worst in the middle classes only, because a woman of the working class can turn to and support herself, however poorly, and a woman of the upper classes usually has some property. And in all classes we may guess that the object of many divorces is not the resumption of a single life, but a change of partners. As this change can be effected easily under the existing law in the state of Washington, it is not certain that the economic emancipation of women would alter the rate there to any startling extent. What is certain is that it could not conceivably raise it to a figure at which even the most panicky alarmist could persuade sensible people that the whole social fabric was tumbling to pieces. When journalists and bishops and American presidents and other simple people describe this Washington result as alarming, they are speaking as a peasant speaks of a motor car or an airplane when he sees one for the first time. All he means is that he is not used to it and therefore fears that it may injure him. Every advance in civilization frightens these honest folk. This is a pity, but if we were to spare their feelings, we should never improve the world at all. To let them frighten us and then pretend that their stupid timidity is virtue and purity and so forth is simply moral cowardice. Male economic slavery and the rights of bachelors. It must not be forgotten that the refusal to accept the indignities, risks, hardships, and divided duties of marriage is not confined to our voluntary old maids. There are men of the and Samuel Butler, whom one can hardly conceive as married men. There are the great ecclesiastics who will not own two loyalties, one to the church and one to the earth. There are men like who marry late and reluctantly solely because they feel that they cannot in honest friendship refuse the status of marriage to any woman of whose attachment to them they have taken any advantage, either in fact or in appearance. No sensible man can, under existing circumstances, advise a woman to keep house with a man without insisting on his marrying her, unless he is independent of conventional, a state of things which can occur only very exceptionally, and a man of honor cannot advise a woman to do for his sake what he would not advise her to do for anyone else. The result is that our and Butler's whom, in their ordinary human aspect, there are a good many become barren old bachelors, and rather savage ones at that. Another difficulty which we always think of in connection with women, but which is by no means without its application to men, is the economic one. The number of men who cannot afford to marry is large enough to produce very serious social results, and the higher the work the man is doing, the more likely he is to find himself in this class until he has reached or passed middle age. The higher departments of science, law, philosophy, poetry, and the fine arts are notoriously starved in youth and early manhood. The marriageable age there, economically speaking, is nearer 50 than 20. Even in business, the leading spirits seldom reach a position of security until they are far beyond the age at which celibacy is tolerable. Account must also be taken of the younger sons of the propertied classes, brought up in households in which the rate of expenditure, though 10 times that possible on a younger son's portion, yet represents the only habit of life he has learnt. Taking all these cases as representing a bachelor class, and bearing in mind that though a man who marries at 40 is not called a bachelor, yet he has for 20 years of his adult life been one, and therefore produced all the social problems that arise out of the existence of unmarried men, we must not shrink from asking whether all these are celibates, even though we know that the question must be answered emphatically in the negative. Some of them marry women of property, thereby reproducing the economic dependence of women on men with the sexes reversed. But there are so few women of property available for this purpose, in comparison to the number of bachelors who cannot afford to marry, that this resource does not solve the problem of the bachelor who cannot afford a wife. If there were no other resources available, bachelors would make love to the wives and daughters of their friends. This being morally inadmissible, a demand arises for a cheap temporary substitute for marriage. A class of women must be found to protect the wives and daughters of the married by keeping company with the bachelor for hire for as long or as short time as the bachelor can afford, on the understanding that no claim is to be made on him after the hiring is ended. And such an institution, as we know, exists among us. It is commonly spoken of as an offense against our marriage morality, but all the experts who write scientific treatises on marriage seem to be agreed that it is, on the contrary, a necessary part of that morality and must stand and fall with it. I do not myself think that this view will bear examination. In my play, Mrs. Warren's Profession, I have shown that the institution in question is an economic phenomenon produced by our underpayment and ill-treatment of women who try to earn an honest living. I am aware that for some reason scientific writers are perversely impatient of this view, and to discredit it, quote police lists of the reasons given by the victims for adopting their trade, and insist on the fact that poverty is not often alleged. But this means only that the actual word is seldom used. If a few thieves were asked what induced them to take to thieving, and some replied poverty, and others hunger, and others desire for excitement, no one would deny that the 3 answers were really one answer, that poverty means hunger, an intolerable lack of variety and pleasure, and in short, all sorts of privations. When a girl similarly interrogated says she wanted fine clothes, or more fun, or the like, she is really saying that she lacked what no woman with plenty of money need lack. The fact that, according to the testimony of men who profess experience in such matters, you may search Europe in vain for a woman in this trade who has the table manners of a lady shows that prostitution is not a vocation, but a slavery to which women are driven by the miseries of honest poverty. When every young woman has an honorable and comfortable livelihood open to her on reasonable terms, the streets will make no more recruits. When every young man can afford to marry, and marriage reform makes it easy in dissolve unions contracted by young and inexperienced people in the event of their turning out badly, or of one of the pair achieving a position neither comfortable nor suitable for the other, both prostitution and will die a natural death. Until then, all talk of purification is idle. It is for that reason that I lay little stress on prostitution here and refer readers who are curious about the psychopathy of and spinsterhood to the monumental work of my friend Havelock. The pathology of marriage. I shall also say as little as possible of the pathology of marriage and its breakwater. Only, as there seems to be no bottom to the abyss of public ignorance on the subject, I am compelled to warn my readers that marriage has a pathology and even a criminology. But they are both so frightful that they have been dealt with not only in such treatises as those of Havelock and many German writers, but in such comparatively popular works as The Heavenly Twins by Sarah Grand, and several of the plays of notably Phil's M. and I purposely pass them by quickly, not only because attention has already been called to them by these devoted writers, but because my mission is not to deal with obvious horrors, but to open the eyes of normal, respectable men to evils which are escaping their consideration. As to the evils of disease and contagion, our consciences are sound enough. What is wrong with us is ignorance of the facts. No doubt this is a very formidable ignorance in a country where the first cry of the soul is, "Don't tell me, I don't want to know," and where frantic denials and furious suppressions indicate everywhere the cowardice and want of faith which conceives life as something too terrible to be faced. In this particular case, "I don't want to know" takes a righteous air and becomes, "I don't want to know anything about the diseases which are the just punishment of wretches who should not be mentioned in my presence or in any book that is intended for family reading." Wicked and foolish as the spirit of this attitude is, the practice of it is so easy and lazy and uppish that it is very common. But its cry is drowned by a louder and more sincere one. We who do not want to know also do not want to go blind, to go mad, to be disfigured, to be barren, to become pestiferous, or to see such things happening to our children. We learn at last that the majority of the victims are not the people of whom we so glibly say serve them right, but quite innocent children and innocent parents, smitten by a contagion which, no matter in what vice it may or may not have originated, contaminates the innocent and the guilty alike once it is launched exactly as any other contagious disease does. That indeed it often hits the innocent and misses the guilty because the guilty know the danger and take elaborate precautions against it, whilst the innocent, who have been either carefully kept from any knowledge of their danger or erroneously led to believe that contagion is possible through misconduct only, run into danger blindfold. Once knock this fact into people's minds, and their self-righteous indifference and intolerance soon change into lively concern for themselves and their families. The criminology of marriage. The pathology of marriage involves the possibility of the most horrible crime imaginable, that of the person who, when suffering from contagious disease, forces the contagion on another person by an act of violence. Such an act occurring between unmarried people would, within the memory of persons now living, have exposed the aggressor to the penalty of death, and it is still punished unmercifully by an extreme term of penal servitude when it occurs, as it sometimes does, through the hideous countryside superstition that it effects a cure when the victim is a virgin. Marriage makes this outrage absolutely legal. You may with impunity do to the person to whom you are married what you may not do to the most despised outcast of the streets. And this is only the extreme instance of the outlawry which our marriage laws affect. In our anxiety to provide for ourselves a little private in which we can indulge ourselves as we please without reproach or interference from law, religion, or even conscience, and this is what marriage has come to mean to many of us, we have forgotten that we cannot escape restraints without foregoing rights, that all the laws that are needed to compel strangers to respect us are equally if not more necessary to compel our husbands and wives to respect us. And that society without law, whether between 2 or 2 million persons, means tyranny and slavery. If the incorrigible sentimentalists here raise their little pipe of "not if they love one another," I tell them, with such patience as is possible, that if they had ever had 5 minutes' experience of love, they would know that love is itself a tyranny requiring special safeguards, that people will perpetrate, for the sake of those they love, exactions and submissions that they would never dream of proposing to or suffering from those they dislike or regard with indifference. That healthy marriages are partnerships of companionable and affectionate friendship, that cases of chronic life-long love, whether sentimental or sensual, ought to be sent to the doctor if not to the executioner. And that honorable men and women, when their circumstances permit it, are so far from desiring to be placed helplessly at one another's mercy that they employ every device the law now admits of, from the most stringent marriage settlements to the employment of separate legal advisers, to neutralize the Alsatian evils of the marriage law. Does it matter? A less obviously silly evasion, and one which has a greater air of common sense, is, after all, seeing that most couples get on very well together, does it matter so much? The same reply might be made by a lazy magistrate when asked for a warrant to arrest a burglar, or by a sleepy fireman wakened by a midnight call for his fire escape. After all, very few people have their houses broken into, and fewer still have them burnt. Does it matter? But tell the magistrate or fireman that it is his house that has been broken into, or his house that has been burnt, and you will be startled by the change in his attitude. Because a mass of people have shaken down into comfort enough to satisfy them, or at least to cause them no more discomfort than they are prepared to put up with for the sake of a quiet life, less lucky and more sensitive and conscientious people should not be condemned to expose themselves to intolerable wrongs. Besides, people ought not to be content with the marriage law, as it is merely because it is not often unbearably uncomfortable. Slaves are very often much more comfortable both in body and mind than fully responsible free men. That does not excuse anybody for embracing slavery. It is no doubt a great pity, from many points of view, that we were not conquered by Napoleon or even by Bismarck, and nonetheless we should have been rightly despised if we had not been prepared to fight them for the right to misgovern ourselves. But as I have said, I am content, in this matter of the evils of our marriage law, to take care of the pence and let the pounds take care of themselves. The crimes and diseases of marriage will force themselves on public attention by their own virulence. I mention them here only because they reveal certain habits of thought and feeling with regard to marriage of which we must rid ourselves if we are to act sensibly when we take the necessary reforms in hand.
Christian marriage.
First among these is the habit of allowing ourselves to be bound not only by the truths of the Christian religion, but by the excesses and extravagances which the Christian movement acquired in its earlier days as a violent reaction against what it still calls paganism. By far the most dangerous of these, because it is a blasphemy against life, and to put it in Christian terms, an accusation of indecency against God, is the notion that sex, with all its operations, is in itself absolutely an obscene thing, and that an immaculate conception is a miracle. So unwholesome an absurdity could only have gained ground under two conditions. 1. A reaction against a society in which sensual luxury had been carried to revolting extremes, and 2. A belief that the world was coming to an end, and that therefore sex was no longer a necessity. Christianity, because it began under these conditions, made sexlessness and communism the two main practical articles of its propaganda, and it has never quite lost its original bias in these directions. In spite of the putting off of the second coming from the lifetime of the apostles to the millennium, and of the great disappointment of the year 1000 AD, in which multitudes of Christians seriously prepared for the end of the world, the prophet who announces that the end is at hand is still popular. Many of the people who ridicule his demonstrations that the fantastic monsters of the book of Revelation are among us in the persons of our own political contemporaries, and who proceed sanely in all their affairs on the assumption that the world is going to last, really do believe that there will be a judgment day, and that it might even be in their own time. A thunderstorm, an eclipse, or any very unusual weather will make them apprehensive and uncomfortable. This explains why, for a long time, the Christian Church refused to have anything to do with marriage. The result was not the abolition of sex, but its excommunication. And of course, the consequences of persuading people that matrimony was an unholy state were so grossly carnal that the Church had to execute a complete right-about-face and try to make people understand that it was a holy state, so holy indeed that it could not be validly inaugurated without the blessing of the Church. And by this teaching, it did something to atone for its earlier blasphemy. But the mischief of chopping and changing your doctrine to meet this or that practical emergency, instead of keeping it adjusted to the whole scheme of life, is that you end by having half a dozen contradictory doctrines to suit half a dozen different emergencies. The Church solemnized and marriage without ever giving up its original Pauline doctrine on the subject. And it soon fell into another confusion. At the point at which it took up marriage and endeavored to make it holy, marriage was, as it still is, largely a survival of the custom of selling women to men. Now in all trades, a marked difference is made in price between a new article and a second-hand one. The moment we meet with this difference in value between human beings, we may know that we are in the slave market, where the conception of our relations to the person sold is neither religious nor natural nor human nor superhuman, but simply commercial. The Church, when it finally gave its blessing to marriage, did not, in its innocence, fathom these commercial traditions. Consequently, it tried to sanctify them too, with grotesque results. The slave dealer having always asked more money for virginity, the Church, instead of detecting the money changer and driving him out of the temple, took him for a sentimental and chivalrous lover, and helped by its only half-discarded doctrine of celibacy, gave virginity a heavenly value to ennoble its commercial pretensions. In short, Mammon, always mighty, put the Church in his pocket, where he keeps it to this day, in spite of the occasional saints and martyrs who contrive from time to get their heads and souls free to testify against him. Divorce a sacramental duty. But Mammon overreached himself when he tried to impose his doctrine of inalienable property on the Church under the guise of indissoluble marriage. For the Church tried to shelter this inhuman doctrine and flat contradiction of the gospel by claiming, and rightly claiming that marriage is a sacrament. So it is, but that is exactly what makes divorce a duty, when the marriage has lost the inward and spiritual grace, of which the marriage ceremony is the outward and visible sign. In vain do bishops stoop to pick up the discarded arguments of the atheists of 50 years ago by pleading that the words of Jesus were in an obscure Aramaic dialect and were probably misunderstood, as Jesus, they think, could not have said anything a bishop would disapprove of. Unless they are prepared to add that the statement that those who take the sacrament with their lips, but not with their hearts, eat and drink their own damnation is also a mistranslation from the Aramaic, they are most solemnly bound to shield marriage from profanation, not merely by permitting divorce, but by making it compulsory in certain cases as the Chinese do. When the great protest of the XVI century came and the Church was reformed in several countries, the Reformation was so largely a rebellion against sacerdotalism that marriage was very nearly excommunicated again. Our modern civil marriage, round which so many fierce controversies and political conflicts have raged, would have been thoroughly approved of by and hailed with relief by Luther. But the instinctive doctrine that there is something holy and mystic in sex, a doctrine which many of us now easily dissociate from any priestly ceremony, but which in those days seemed to all who felt it to need a ritual affirmation, could not be thrown on the scrap heap with the sale of indulgences and the like, and so the Reformation left marriage where it was, a curious mixture of commercial sex slavery, early Christian sex abhorrence, and later Christian sex sanctification. And how strong was the feeling that a husband or a wife is an article of property, greatly depreciated in value at second hand, and not to be used or touched by any person but the proprietor, may be learnt from Shakespeare. His most infatuated and passionate lovers are, and yet both of them betray the commercial and proprietary instinct the moment they lose their tempers. I found you, says, reproaching Cleopatra, as a morsel cold upon dead Caesar's trencher. His worst agony is the thought of keeping a corner in the thing he loves for others' uses. But this is not what a man feels about the thing he loves, but about the thing he owns. I never understood the full significance of this outburst until I one day heard a lady, in the course of a private discussion as to the feasibility of group marriage, say with cold disgust that she would as soon think of lending her toothbrush to another woman as her husband. The sense of outraged manhood with which I felt myself, and all other husbands thus reduced to the rank of a toilet appliance, gave me a very unpleasant taste of what might have felt had she overheard this outburst. I was so dumbfounded that I had not the presence of mind to ask the lady whether she insisted on having a doctor, a nurse, a dentist, and even a priest and solicitor all to herself as well. But I had too often heard men speak of women as if they were mere personal conveniences to feel surprised that exactly the same view is held, only more fastidiously, by women. All these views must be got rid of before we can have any healthy public opinion, on which depends our having a healthy population, on the subject of sex, and consequently of marriage. Whilst the subject is considered shameful and sinful, we shall have no systematic instruction in sexual hygiene, because such lectures as are given in Germany, France, and even prudish America, where the great Miltonic tradition in this matter still lives, will be considered a corruption of that youthful innocence which now subsists on nasty stories and whispered traditions handed down from generation to generation of. Stories and traditions which conceal nothing of sex but its dignity, its honor, its sacredness, its rank as the first necessity of society and the deepest concern of the nation. We shall continue to maintain the white slave trade and protect its exploiters by, on the one hand, tolerating the white slave as the necessary breakwater of marriage, and on the other, trampling on her and degrading her until she has nothing to hope from our courts. And so, with policemen at every corner and law triumphant all over Europe, she will still be smuggled and cattle-driven from one end of the civilized world to the other, cheated, beaten, bullied, and hunted into the streets to disgusting overwork, without daring to utter the cry for help that brings, not rescue, but exposure and infamy, yet revenging herself terribly in the end by scattering blindness and sterility, pain and disfigurement. Insanity and death among us, with the certainty that we are much too pious and genteel to allow such things to be mentioned with a view to saving either her or ourselves from them. And all the time we shall keep enthusiastically investing her trade with every allurement that the art of the novelist, the playwright, the dancer, the milliner, the painter, the limelight man, and the sentimental poet can devise, after which we shall continue to be very much shocked and surprised when the cry of the youth, of the young wife, of the mother, of the infected nurse, and of all the other victims, direct and indirect, arises with its invariable refrain, "Why did nobody warn me?" What is to become of the children? I must not reply flippantly, make them all wards in chancery, yet that would be enough to put any sensible person on the track of the reply. One would think, to hear the way in which people sometimes ask the question, that not only does marriage prevent the difficulty from ever arising, but that nothing except divorce can ever raise it. It is true that if you divorce the parents, the children have to be disposed of. But if you hang the parents, or imprison the parents, or take the children out of the custody of the parents because they hold Shelley's opinions, or if the parents die, the same difficulty arises. And as these things have happened again and again, and as we have had plenty of experience of divorce decrees and separation orders, the attempt to use children as an obstacle to divorce is hardly worth arguing with. We shall deal with the children just as we should deal with them if their homes were broken up by any other cause. There is a sense in which children are a real obstacle to divorce. They give parents a common interest which keeps together many a couple who, if childless, would separate. The marriage law is superfluous in such cases. This is shown by the fact that the proportion of childless divorces is much larger than the proportion of divorces from all causes. But it must not be forgotten that the interest of the children forms one of the most powerful arguments for divorce. An unhappy household is a bad nursery. There is something to be said for the polygynous or polyandrous household as a school for children. Children really do suffer from having too few parents. This is why uncles and aunts and tutors and governesses are often so good for children. But it is just the polygamous household which our marriage law allows to be broken up, and which, as we have seen, is not possible as a typical institution in a democratic country where the numbers of the sexes are about equal. Therefore, polygyny and polyandry as a means of educating children fall to the ground, and with them, I think, must go the opinion which has been expressed by and others, that an extension of divorce, whilst admitting many new grounds for it, might exclude the ground of adultery. There are, however, clearly many things that make some of our domestic interiors little private hells for children, especially when the children are quite content in them, which would justify any intelligent state in breaking up the home, and giving the custody of the children either to the parent whose conscience had revolted against the corruption of the children, or to neither. Which brings me to the point that divorce should no longer be confined to cases in which one of the parties petitions for it. If, for instance, you have a thoroughly rascally couple making a living by infamous means, and bringing up their children to their trade, the king's proctor, instead of pursuing his present purely mischievous function of preventing couples from being divorced by proving that they both desire it, might very well intervene and divorce these children from their parents. At present, if the queen herself were to rescue some unfortunate child from degradation and misery and place her in a respectable home, and some unmentionable pair of blackguards claimed the child, and proved that they were its father and mother, the child would be given to them in the name of the sanctity of the home and the holiness of parentage. After perpetrating which crime, the law would calmly send an education officer to take the child out of the parents' hands several hours a day in the still more sacred name of compulsory education. Of course, what would really happen would be that the couple would blackmail the queen for their consent to the salvation of the child, unless, indeed, a hint from a police inspector convinced them that bad characters cannot always rely on pedantically constitutional treatment when they come into conflict with persons in high station. The truth is, not only must the bond between man and wife be made subject to a reasonable consideration of the welfare of the parties concerned and of the community, but the whole family bond as well. The theory that the wife is the property of the husband or the husband of the wife is not a whit less abhorrent and mischievous than the theory that the child is the property of the parent. Parental bondage will go the way of conjugal bondage. Indeed, the order of reform should rather be put the other way about, for the helplessness of children has already compelled the state to intervene between parent and child more than between husband and wife. If you pay less than £40 a year rent, you will sometimes feel tempted to say to the vaccination officer, the school attendance officer, and the sanitary inspector, "Is this child mine or yours?" The answer is that as the child is a vital part of the nation cannot afford to leave it at the irresponsible disposal of any individual or couple of individuals as a mere small parcel of private property. The only solid ground that the parent can take is that as the state, in spite of its imposing name, can, when all is said, do nothing with the child except place it in the charge of some human being or another, the parent is no worse a custodian than a stranger. And though this proposition may seem highly questionable at first sight to those who imagine that only parents spoil children, yet those who realize that children are as often spoilt by severity and coldness as by indulgence, and that the notion that natural parents are any worse than adopted parents is probably as complete an illusion as the notion that they are any better, see no serious likelihood that state action will detach children from their parents more than it does at present. Nay, it is even likely that the present system of taking the children out of the parents' hands and having the parental duty performed by officials will, as poverty and ignorance become the exception instead of the rule, give way to the system of simply requiring certain results, beginning with the baby's weight and ending perhaps with some sort of practical arts degree, but leaving parents and children to achieve the results as they best may. Such freedom is, of course, impossible in our present poverty-stricken circumstances. As long as the masses of our people are too poor to be good parents or good anything else except beasts of burden, it is no use requiring much more from them but hewing of wood and drawing of water. Whatever is to be done must be done for them mostly, alas, by people whose superiority is merely technical. Until we abolish poverty, it is impossible to push rational measures of any kind very far. The wolf at the door will compel us to live in a state of siege, and to do everything by a bureaucratic martial law that would be quite unnecessary and indeed intolerable in a prosperous community. But however we settle the question, we must make the parent justify his custody of the child exactly as we should make a stranger justify it. If a family is not achieving the purposes of a family, it should be dissolved just as a marriage should when it, too, is not achieving the purposes of marriage. The notion that there is or ever can be anything magical and inviolable in the legal relations of domesticity, and the curious confusion of ideas which makes some of our bishops imagine that in the phrase, whom God hath joined, the word God means the district registrar or the Reverend John Smith or William Jones, must be got rid of. Means of breaking up undesirable families are as necessary to the preservation of the family as means of dissolving undesirable marriages are to the preservation of marriage. If our domestic laws are kept so inhuman that they at last provoke a furious general insurrection against them as they already provoke many private ones, we shall in a very literal sense empty the baby out with the bath by abolishing an institution, which needs nothing more than a little obvious and easy rationalizing to make it not only harmless but comfortable, honorable, and useful. The cost of divorce. But please do not imagine that the evils of indissoluble marriage can be cured by divorce laws administered on our present plan. The very cheapest undefended divorce, even when conducted by a solicitor for its own sake and that of humanity, costs at least £30 out-of-pocket expenses. To a client on business terms, it costs about 3 times as much. Until divorce is as cheap as marriage, marriage will remain indissoluble for all except the handful of people to whom £100 is a procurable sum. For the enormous majority of us, there is no difference in this respect between 100 and a quadrillion. Divorce is the one thing you may not sue for and form a pauperous. Let me then recommend as follows. Make divorce as easy, as cheap, and as private as marriage. Make divorce as easy, as cheap, and as private as marriage. Grant divorce at the request of either party, whether the other consents or not, and admit no other ground than the request, which should be made without stating any reasons. Grant divorce at the request of either party, whether the other consents or not, and admit no other ground than the request, which should be made without stating any reasons. Confine the power of dissolving marriage for misconduct to the state acting on the petition of the king's proctor or other suitable functionary, who may, however, be moved by either party to intervene in ordinary request cases, not to prevent the divorce taking place, but to enforce alimony if it be refused and the case is one which needs it. Confine the power of dissolving marriage for misconduct to the state acting on the petition of the king's proctor or other suitable functionary, who may, however, be moved by either party to intervene in ordinary request cases, not to prevent the divorce taking place, but to enforce alimony if it be refused and the case is one which needs it. Make it impossible for marriage to be used as a punishment as it is at present. Send the husband and wife to penal servitude if you disapprove of their conduct and want to punish them, but do not send them back to perpetual wedlock. Make it impossible for marriage to be used as a punishment as it is at present. Send the husband and wife to penal servitude if you disapprove of their conduct and want to punish them, but do not send them back to perpetual wedlock. If, on the other hand, you think a couple perfectly innocent and well conducted, do not condemn them also to perpetual wedlock against their wills, thereby making the treatment of what you consider innocence on both sides the same as the treatment of what you consider guilt on both sides. If, on the other hand, you think a couple perfectly innocent and well conducted, do not condemn them also to perpetual wedlock against their wills, thereby making the treatment of what you consider innocence on both sides the same as the treatment of what you consider guilt on both sides. Place the work of a wife and mother on the same footing as other work, that is, on the footing of labor worthy of its hire, and provide for unemployment in it exactly as for unemployment in shipbuilding or in other recognized breadwinning trade. Place the work of a wife and mother on the same footing as other work, that is, on the footing of labor worthy of its hire, and provide for unemployment in it exactly as for unemployment in shipbuilding or in other recognized breadwinning trade. And take and deal with all the consequences of these acts of justice, instead of letting yourself be frightened out of reason and good sense by fear of consequences. We must finally adapt our institutions to human nature. In the long run, our present plan of trying to force human nature into of existing abuses, superstitions, and corrupt interests produces the explosive forces that wreck civilization. And take and deal with all the consequences of these acts of justice, instead of letting yourself be frightened out of reason and good sense by fear of consequences. We must finally adapt our institutions to human nature. In the long run, our present plan of trying to force human nature into of existing abuses, superstitions, and corrupt interests produces the explosive forces that wreck civilization. Never forget that if you leave your law to judges and your religion to bishops, you will presently find yourself without either law or religion. If you doubt this, ask any decent judge or bishop. Do not ask somebody who does not know what a judge is, or what a bishop is, or what the law is, or what religion is. In other words, do not ask your newspaper. Journalists are too poorly paid in this country to know anything that is fit for publication. Never forget that if you leave your law to judges and your religion to bishops, you will presently find yourself without either law or religion. If you doubt this, ask any decent judge or bishop. Do not ask somebody who does not know what a judge is, or what a bishop is, or what the law is, or what religion is. In other words, do not ask your newspaper. Journalists are too poorly paid in this country to know anything that is fit for publication. Conclusions. To sum up, we have to depend on the solution of the problem of unemployment, probably on the principles laid down in the Minority Report of the Royal Commission on the Poor Law, to make the sexual relations between men and women decent and honorable by making women economically independent of men, and in the younger son section of the upper classes, men economically independent of women. We also have to bring ourselves into line with the rest of Protestant civilization by providing means for dissolving all unhappy, improper, and inconvenient marriages. And as it is our cautious custom to lag behind the rest of the world to see how their experiments in reform turn out before venturing ourselves, and then take advantage of their experience to get ahead of them, we should recognize that the ancient system of specifying grounds for divorce, such as adultery, cruelty, drunkenness, felony, insanity, vagrancy, neglect to provide for wife and children, desertion, public defamation, violent temper, religious heterodoxy, contagious disease, outrages, indignities, personal abuse, mental anguish, conduct rendering life burdensome, and so forth, all these are examples from some code actually in force at present, is a mistake because the only effect of compelling people to plead and prove misconduct is that cases are manufactured and clean linen purposely smirched and washed in public, to the great distress and disgrace of innocent children and relatives. Whilst the grounds have at the same time to be made so general that any sort of human conduct may be brought within them by a little special pleading, and a little mental reservation on the part of witnesses examined on oath. When it to conduct rendering life burdensome, it is clear that no marriage is any longer indissoluble, and the sensible thing to do then is to grant divorce whenever it is desired without asking why. And B, there is a point of some technical interest to be noted in this play. The customary division into acts and scenes has been disused, and a return made to unity of time and place, as observed in the ancient Greek drama. In the foregoing tragedy, The Doctor's Dilemma, there are 5 acts, the place is altered 5 times, and the time is spread over an undetermined period of more than a year. No doubt the strain on the attention of the audience and on the ingenuity of the playwright is much less, but I find in practice that the Greek form is inevitable when drama reaches a certain point in poetic and intellectual evolution. Its adoption was not, on my part, a deliberate display of virtuosity in form, but simply the spontaneous falling of a play of ideas into the form most suitable to it, which turned out to be the classical form. Getting married in several acts and scenes, with the time spread over a long period, would be impossible. Getting Married by George Bernard Shaw. May you do good and not evil. May you find forgiveness for yourself and forgive others. May you share freely, never taking more than you give. Copyright pages exist to tell you that you can't do something. Unlike them, this page exists to tell you that the writing and artwork in this are believed to be in the United States public domain. That is, they are believed to be free of copyright restrictions in the United States. The United States public domain represents our collective cultural heritage, and items in it are free for anyone in the United States to do almost anything at all with, without having to get permission. Copyright laws are different all over the world, and the source text or artwork in this may still be copyrighted in other countries. If you're not located in the United States, you must check your local laws before using this. Standard makes no representations regarding the copyright status of the source text or artwork in this in any country other than the United States. Non-authorship activities performed on items that are in the public domain's so-called sweat of the brow work don't create a new copyright. That means that nobody can claim a new copyright on an item that is in the public domain for, among other things, work like digitization, markup, or typography. Regardless, the contributors to this release their contributions under the terms in the CC01 Universal Public Domain Dedication, thus dedicating to the worldwide public domain all of the work they've done on this, including but not limited to metadata, the imprint, colophon, this, and any changes or enhancements to, or markup on the original text and artwork. This dedication doesn't change the copyright status of the source text or artwork. We make this dedication in the interest of enriching our global cultural heritage, to promote free and culture around the world, and to give back to the unrestricted culture that has given all of us so much.